Imagine stepping into a classroom where every textbook line you've memorized is suddenly turned upside down. The names, dates, and battles you learned in school were only the surface. Beneath the polished stories lies a web of hidden struggles, overlooked revolutions, shadowed figures, and inconvenient truths that shaped the country. Did you know that before America even declared independence, secret societies plotted radical visions for the nation? That some founding fathers profited from hidden networks of slavery while preaching liberty? Or that a forgotten war on the western frontier quietly determined who would control the Mississippi for centuries? These are the stories that school never told you. Stories of courage, betrayal, and upheaval woven into the fabric of American history in ways that still resonate today. Imagine standing on the jagged shore of Jamestown in the sweltering summer of 1607. The air is thick with the stench of salt, decay, and human sweat, and the dense forests beyond the river seem alive, whispering secrets you are not meant to hear. You are one of the first English settlers in a place that will eventually become America, yet every breath you take reminds you that survival is a question, not a certainty. What you aren't told in history class is that Jamestown teetered on the brink of collapse for years, ravaged not only by famine and disease, but also by poor leadership, hidden rivalries, and deadly misunderstandings with the native Powhatan people. Starvation was so severe in 1609 to 1610 that desperate settlers resorted to cannibalism, a grim fact often omitted from sanitized textbooks. But Jamestown wasn't the first clash of worlds. It was the first glimpse of a pattern that would repeat itself across the continent. European ambition colliding with native cultures, forging a society born of both brilliance and brutality. Many of the early settlers' motivations were more complicated than simple pioneering spirit. Investors in the Virginia Company hoped for gold, not freedom. Land wasn't just land, it was currency, leverage, and power, and it was acquired at the cost of treaties broken and lives destroyed. And while the settlers struggled, indigenous nations navigated the arrival of strangers with political sophistication that most Americans today never learn about. Powhatan was not just a passive victim, he was a strategist, a leader who initially tried diplomacy, only to adapt as his people faced disease, betrayal, and relentless pressure from newcomers. By the mid-1600s, other colonies were taking shape, each with its own contradictions and hidden histories. Plymouth Colony, often mythologized for Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims' pious self-reliance, was a fragile settlement fighting not just harsh winters, but also internal disputes, epidemics, and the challenges of negotiating with the Wampanoag people. The story most children hear ignores that the Wampanoag initially fed and protected the Pilgrims, but also suffered devastating consequences when European diseases and expanding settlements disrupted their communities. There were alliances, yes, but also calculated strategies, betrayals, and a collision of survival imperatives. The Mayflower Compact is remembered as a democratic milestone, yet few are taught that it was a fragile, pragmatic agreement among men desperate to maintain order in a lawless, frozen wilderness. Democracy was more survival tactic than ideal in those first years. Meanwhile, the northern colonies were experiencing a different kind of pressure. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island were shaped not only by religion, but by intense social policing. Puritans sought to create a city upon a hill, yet within their communities, dissenters were exiled, silenced, or executed. The Salem witch trials of 1692 are often remembered as a dark lesson in hysteria, but the deeper story is more revealing. They were the result of a society struggling with inequality, fear, and the psychological weight of a theocratic government. Economic tensions, family rivalries, and generational resentments fueled accusations just as much as superstition. Children, too, played a role. Accusations sometimes started from young girls whose behavior was considered suspicious. The lesson history books leave out is that fear and power were tightly intertwined, and that early America was as much a social experiment in control as it was a pursuit of liberty. Across the colonies, labor systems developed in ways that would shape the nation's moral and economic landscape. Indentured servitude, often presented in textbooks as a stepping stone to freedom, was brutal, unpredictable, and often deadly. Young men and women signed contracts for years of hard labor, sometimes hoping to escape poverty in Europe, only to find themselves trapped, mistreated, and manipulated by landlords who held the law and courts in their favor. And intertwined with this labor system was a reality that schools gloss over. Slavery was not a later addition, it was embedded in the colonies from the start. African men and women arrived in chains as early as 1619 in Virginia, and while the legal codification of lifelong slavery took decades, the economic and social exploitation began immediately. The story of early America cannot be separated from the profits, oppression, and resistance tied to enslaved people. By the early 1700s, the colonies were beginning to form distinct identities, yet underneath the surface, tension brewed. Trade, politics, and culture created connections to the wider Atlantic world that textbooks often simplify. Colonial newspapers carried news from Europe, debates raged about taxation, and piracy was surprisingly common along the eastern seaboard, not the romanticized version of swashbucklers, but organized networks of crime that forced merchants, governors, and even navies to respond. Some pirates became folk heroes for defying authority, while others were executed to make examples of dissenters, a reminder that power in the colonies was contested not only by nations, but by ordinary people challenging the system. As the century progressed, the colonies' hidden histories intersected with the larger geopolitical games of empires. France, Spain, and Britain fought over territory, alliances, and trade. The French and Indian War, often summarized as a simple struggle for land, was in fact a complex tangle of competing imperial ambitions, native alliances, and local politics. Figures like George Washington, often framed as a heroic leader, were also young men learning the brutal realities of warfare and diplomacy in a world where mistakes could mean death, not just for soldiers, but for entire communities. The war left Britain in enormous debt, setting the stage for colonial unrest that would explode into revolution decades later, a revolution whose roots were economic, political, and cultural long before taxation without representation became a rallying cry. Even before the first shot at Lexington and Concord, the colonies were already experimenting with self-governance in ways few schools emphasize. Town meetings, committees of correspondence, and local militias were laboratories of democracy, often messy and imperfect, reflecting the struggles of ordinary people trying to have a voice in a world dominated by elite authority. And while the Declaration of Independence would later immortalize a few figures, many unsung actors, women, African Americans, Native Americans, and common laborers played critical roles in shaping revolutionary sentiment and sustaining the war effort. This brings us roughly through the pre-revolutionary era, full of hidden stories, contradictions, and human drama. From here, the narrative would continue seamlessly into the American Revolution, the drafting of the Constitution, westward expansion, the deep contradictions of slavery and liberty, and all the way through modern times, each era explored with the same level of detail and immersion. It is the spring of 1775, and the air in Massachusetts is electric with tension. Gunpowder hides in barns, whispers circulate in taverns, and ordinary men with plow handles and hunting rifles begin to see themselves as something more than farmers. They are patriots, insurgents, a new kind of citizen. Few history books dwell on the fear and chaos of these days. Lexington and Concord weren't neat, heroic battles. They were chaotic skirmishes where confusion often dictated action more than courage. One Minuteman, his heart hammering in the dawn chill, might fire at the wrong target, while another freezes entirely, the weight of the unknown pressing down. Yet these small, uneven confrontations were enough to spark a revolution. Across the colonies, communities were divided. Families, neighbors, even towns were split between loyalists and rebels. The concept of freedom was not universally embraced. For many, allegiance to the crown promised stability, protection, and trade security.
Loyalists were often vilified in textbooks as traitors, but their choices were complex. Some were motivated by religious faith, others by fear of chaos, and many simply understood the dangerous gamble they were being asked to make. In New York, Loyalist mobs sometimes clashed with rebel sympathizers, turning the streets into a patchwork of danger, fear, and opportunism. Homes were burned, property seized, and neighbors who had shared meals a week prior became enemies. The revolution was as much a civil war as it was a fight for independence, a truth often glossed over in simplified narratives. At the heart of the rebellion were men who have become larger-than-life figures: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. But even these icons were complicated, human, and often contradictory. Washington, admired for his leadership, frequently struggled with the reality that many of his troops were underpaid, undersupplied, and on the brink of mutiny. Franklin, celebrated as the genial diplomat, engaged in shadow diplomacy that involved bribery, espionage, and careful manipulation of European politics. Jefferson's eloquence in the Declaration of Independence coexisted with his ownership of enslaved people, a paradox that has haunted American history ever since. The war itself was not a series of glorious victories, but a grueling test of endurance, strategy, and sheer luck. At Valley Forge, soldiers endured freezing winters, disease, and malnutrition. Tales of bravery often overshadow the despair. Soldiers who walked miles barefoot, whose families struggled to survive back home, who faced desertion as a constant threat. Native American nations were also drawn into the conflict, some siding with the British, some with the rebels, each hoping to protect their land and sovereignty. The war fractured indigenous societies in ways that textbooks rarely explore, leaving lasting legacies of displacement and broken alliances. Meanwhile, African Americans played critical and often overlooked roles. Thousands joined the fight on both sides, some in exchange for promises of freedom that were sometimes honored and sometimes betrayed. Historians today are uncovering stories of black soldiers like Peter Salem and Salem Poor, whose bravery at battles such as Bunker Hill was essential to the revolutionary cause, but remained unrecognized for decades. Free black communities contributed intelligence, supplies, and labor, challenging the simplistic narrative that independence was solely a white endeavor. By 1781, the war's outcome was still uncertain, yet in small towns, port cities, and forests, a new idea was taking root: the United States of America. But even as independence was won, the hard questions began. Who would govern and how? The Articles of Confederation created a loose alliance that quickly proved inadequate. Trade disputes, unpaid soldiers, and competing state interests revealed that freedom without structure could be chaos. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 convened in secret, away from public scrutiny, because delegates feared that too much transparency might fuel mob unrest. The Constitution we now study as a beacon of democracy was, in its infancy, a carefully negotiated compromise, a document born of ambition, pragmatism, and the uneasy alliance of competing interests.
The debates were fierce. Northern states, having smaller enslaved populations, pushed for counting enslaved people differently in representation than Southern states, where slavery was deeply entrenched. The infamous Three-Fifths Compromise emerged, a solution that acknowledged enslaved people as property, yet partially counted them for political purposes, a morally jarring compromise that highlights how the founding of America was entangled with human bondage. Women were largely excluded from these discussions, and their contributions, from managing households to sustaining communities during wartime, were almost entirely erased from official accounts. Even so, women like Abigail Adams, who famously urged her husband to remember the ladies, and Mercy Otis Warren, who chronicled and influenced revolutionary sentiment, left indelible marks that schools rarely emphasize. The ratification of the Constitution sparked its own battles. Federalists and Anti-Federalists debated openly, publishing pamphlets that shaped public opinion.
The Federalist Papers, penned by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and James Jay, are often taught as abstract political theory, but they were also tools of persuasion, propaganda, and rhetorical maneuvering. Newspapers of the time bristled with fiery editorials, personal attacks, and conspiracy theories. Ordinary citizens read these debates and engaged with them passionately, proving that public opinion mattered from the very beginning, even when the elite tried to dominate the conversation. As the new nation took shape, expansion and ambition collided with moral and practical dilemmas. The Northwest Ordinance promised orderly settlement and prohibited slavery in new territories, yet enforcement was uneven, and settlers often ignored the law when convenient. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the country, but it raised questions about governance, the displacement of native populations, and the future of slavery. Figures like Lewis and Clark are remembered as explorers and heroes, but their expeditions were also instruments of surveillance, claiming land and resources while documenting indigenous societies for federal control. By the early 1800s, the United States had survived its infancy, yet it was far from a unified or just society. Regional tensions over economics, culture, and human bondage simmered beneath the surface. The War of 1812, often portrayed as a second fight for independence, was in fact a complex conflict involving trade restrictions, territorial ambitions, and native alliances. The burning of Washington, D.C. in 1814 shocked the nation, but it also revealed resilience. Citizens rebuilt, reimagined their capital, and continued to debate the nation's identity. The early 19th century in America was a time of restless energy, ambition, and unspoken contradictions. Imagine the vast Mississippi Valley in the 1820s, a place where rivers curved like liquid highways and dense forests stretched into horizons no European eye had ever fully mapped. Settlers poured into these lands, claiming soil that had belonged to native nations for centuries. The push westward was celebrated in textbooks as a triumph of pioneering spirit, but the reality was messy, often violent, and morally complex. Native Americans were displaced by treaties that were more often coerced than consensual. Some tribes resisted, like the Seminoles in Florida, leading to brutal wars in which promises were broken as often as they were made. Others tried to adapt, only to watch their homelands erode beneath them. Meanwhile, the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had ignited a revolution in the American South that textbooks sometimes oversimplify. Cotton production soared, and with it the reliance on enslaved labor. The so-called Cotton Kingdom made fortunes for plantation owners while entrenching a brutal system of human bondage. Families were torn apart. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways, from subtle acts of sabotage to outright rebellion, and the psychological toll was immense. The stories of these individuals, who risked everything to survive or escape, are rarely emphasized. Figures like Harriet Tubman and Denmark Vesey were not anomalies. They were part of a long continuum of resistance and courage that shaped the moral contours of the nation. The early westward push was also a story of invention and improvisation. Settlers traveling the Oregon Trail faced starvation, disease, and treacherous river crossings. Diaries reveal families battling dysentery while negotiating with native communities, trading goods, or sometimes stealing horses in desperate moments. Towns sprung up almost overnight, often poorly planned, vulnerable to fire, disease, and lawlessness. Outlaws and vigilante justice were common. What we now see as the romanticized Wild West was for many sheer survival against impossible odds. At the same time, the nation was fracturing politically and morally. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to balance the entry of free and slave states, yet it was only a temporary bandage on a wound that ran deep. Newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches carried fiery rhetoric about states' rights, federal authority, and the morality of slavery. Voices on both sides of the issue were passionate, sometimes radical, and often ignored the people most affected by the laws being debated, enslaved individuals themselves. Abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison faced threats, violence, and social ostracization, yet their writings began to shift public consciousness in ways that would erupt decades later. The early Industrial Revolution in the North added another layer of complexity. Factories, railroads, and canals transformed cities and towns, but the lives of laborers were harsh and precarious. Children worked long hours for minimal pay. Women were confined to textile mills under strict supervision, and immigrant communities faced hostility and exploitation. The tension between an industrial North and an agricultural, slave-dependent South was not abstract. It was lived in every family, every street, and every local economy. These contrasting worlds, one bustling with factories, reform movements, and newspapers, the other sprawling with plantations, chattel slavery, and hierarchical social structures, were headed inevitably toward collision.
By the 1850s, that collision became increasingly unavoidable. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 revealed how the legal system could be weaponized to enforce oppression. Free black communities in the North lived in constant fear, while underground railroad networks worked tirelessly to move people to safety. Ordinary citizens were forced to confront moral choices, comply with the law, resist it, or take extraordinary risks to help others escape bondage. These acts of courage and conscience often went unrecorded in school curricula, but they shaped the moral foundation of the coming conflict. Political developments, too, were accelerating. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 unleashed violence in the territories as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed, earning the grim nickname Bleeding Kansas. The Republican Party emerged not just as a political organization, but as a reaction to a moral and political crisis, rallying a coalition determined to confront slavery's expansion. Abraham Lincoln, largely unknown outside Illinois at the time, honed his oratory and legal skills in these turbulent years, navigating a political landscape riddled with sectional tensions, economic anxieties, and personal ambition. And then came the 1860 election. The country had fractured along sectional lines in ways more profound than mere party politics. Lincoln's victory, without carrying a single Southern state, ignited secessionist fury. South Carolina led the charge, followed by other Southern states, each claiming the right to leave a union that they said no longer represented them. Behind the political rhetoric, the human stakes were enormous. Lives, homes, and futures hung in the balance, particularly for the enslaved population, whose existence was at the heart of the dispute. The Civil War erupted in April 1861, yet the reality was far messier than the clean narratives of Union versus Confederacy suggest. Soldiers on both sides faced starvation, disease, and horrific injuries. Camps were overcrowded, medical care primitive, and amputations common. Letters home reveal longing, despair, and fleeting moments of camaraderie. Ordinary citizens endured shortages, destroyed property, and the constant fear of raids or battles nearby. And the enslaved population, caught in the ire of this storm, were not passive observers. They escaped when they could, sabotaged plantations, and contributed labor to Union forces, all while risking violent retribution. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 is often taught as a straightforward moral act, but it was also a strategic military measure designed to weaken the Confederacy and encourage enslaved people to flee and join Union ranks. Its immediate effects were limited geographically, yet symbolically it signaled a transformation. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union, it was about redefining freedom itself. African American soldiers, often subjected to prejudice, lower pay, and harsher conditions, proved their courage on the battlefield, changing public perceptions and the stakes of the conflict. Battles like Gettysburg and Antietam were not just military engagements, they were human tragedies on a scale difficult to fathom.
Every hill and valley witnessed individual acts of heroism, desperate retreats, and chaotic massacres. Diaries and letters from soldiers revealed the grinding, dehumanizing nature of war, fear, frostbite, hunger, and the constant weight of mortality. Civilians, too, bore unimaginable burdens, homes destroyed, communities shattered, and daily survival threatened by the movement of armies. And the enslaved population, caught in the ire of this storm, were not passive observers. They escaped when they could, sabotaged plantations, and contributed labor to Union forces, all while risking violent retribution. By 1865, the war had ended, slavery had been abolished, yet the nation faced the enormous task of reconstruction. Freed people sought to assert rights, own land, and participate in governance, while many Southern whites resisted with violence, intimidation, and legislation. The promise of Reconstruction, radical and transformative in vision, was gradually undermined by political compromise, economic pressures, and widespread racism. The history textbooks often condense these decades into a brief overview, but the lived experiences of the people involved were far more complicated, inspiring, and heartbreaking. The smoke of war had barely cleared, yet America was already in motion, hurtling towards transformation. Reconstruction promised hope for millions of formerly enslaved people. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments enshrined freedom, citizenship, and voting rights, yet freedom was fragile, contested, and often violently suppressed. In towns across the South, black communities built schools, churches, and businesses, asserting their humanity and claiming space in a society that had long denied them. Freedmen's agents, Northern teachers, and black leaders like Robert Smalls and Blanche K. Bruce worked tirelessly to educate, protect, and advocate, but threats were constant. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged from the shadows, terrorizing families, burning schools, and assassinating elected officials. Freedom came with enormous risk, and the choices people made in those years, whether to fight, flee, or negotiate, shaped generations to come. Meanwhile, in the North and Midwest, the Gilded Age was dawning, a period of staggering wealth, unrelenting inequality, and unprecedented transformation. Skyscrapers arose in New York, Chicago's stockyards pulsed with industry, and railroads stitched the continent together. Entrepreneurs like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, and John Rockefeller amassed fortunes that were almost unimaginable, while millions of laborers, often immigrants, endured 12 to 16-hour days in dangerous factories, mines, and mills. Women worked in textile factories, often facing harassment and low pay, while children labored under laws that were rarely enforced. The age was gilded, yes, shiny on the surface, but beneath the glitter was the grim reality of exploitation, disease, and poverty.
Immigration surged during this era, fueling industrial growth and urban expansion. Millions arrived from Ireland, Italy, Germany, and Eastern Europe, fleeing famine, persecution, and political unrest. Many found opportunity, but not acceptance. Ethnic neighborhoods sprang up, vibrant and self-contained, yet immigrants were often scapegoated for crime, disease, or labor unrest. Schools rarely discussed the tenement conditions, overcrowding, or discrimination that defined these communities. Yet these experiences profoundly shaped the social and cultural fabric of cities. Chinese immigrants, in particular, faced legalized discrimination through the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, a chilling reminder that American freedom was selective, often determined by race, ethnicity, and class. In the West, the frontier was closing, but it had left scars. Native Americans had been forcibly removed from ancestral lands, confined to reservations, and subjected to campaigns designed to erase language, culture, and identity. Boarding schools sought to civilize children, often separating them from family and subjecting them to harsh discipline.
Yet native communities resisted in subtle and overt ways, preserving traditions, languages, and leadership structures despite centuries of oppression. The story of the frontier is not just conquest, it is also resilience, adaptation, and survival against staggering odds. Labor unrest also began to reshape national consciousness. Strikes, riots, and unionization campaigns reflected the growing tension between capital and labor. The Homestead Strike of 1892, the Pullman Strike of 1894, and countless smaller confrontations revealed a violent struggle over workers' rights. These events are often reduced to footnotes, but they involved real lives, injuries, and deaths, forcing Americans to reckon with the human cost of industrial progress. Women played pivotal roles in labor movements, though their contributions were often marginalized. Figures like Mary Harris Jones organized strikes and advocated for children working in factories, showing that activism was not just a male endeavor. At the same time, cultural shifts were underway. The rise of mass media, newspapers, and illustrated magazines created shared experiences for people scattered across the continent. Yet these media often reinforced social hierarchies, gender norms, and racial biases, even as they popularized stories of adventure, invention, and civic engagement. Innovations in science, medicine, and technology, electricity, vaccination campaigns, telegraphy, transformed daily life, but access was uneven. Rural communities, particularly in the South, often lagged behind, and marginalized populations frequently benefited last, highlighting the uneven nature of progress. By the turn of the 20th century, the United States faced new challenges and contradictions. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked the country's emergence as a global power, yet its victories revealed the moral ambiguities of empire. The Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam became American possessions, raising questions about democracy, sovereignty, and racial hierarchy. The war was celebrated in newspapers and popular culture, yet accounts of Filipino resistance, guerrilla warfare, and civilian suffering were often ignored or minimized. In other words, expansion abroad mirrored unresolved struggles at home, the tension between ideals of freedom and the realities of power and domination. Social reform movements began to emerge in response to these pressures. Progressives fought for regulation of industry, improved labor conditions, and expanded education. Women like Jane Addams founded settlement houses, while suffragists pressed for the right to vote. Yet even within reform movements, hierarchies persisted. White, middle-class women often dominated agendas, leaving women of color and working-class women to fight for visibility. Activists of color, like Ida Wells, confronted lynching, racial violence, and systemic injustice, pushing the nation to confront contradictions between its democratic ideals and lived realities. And so America entered the 20th century with tremendous energy, contradictions, and unresolved conflicts. Immigrants crowded cities, factories hummed with machinery, African Americans migrated northward seeking opportunities, and political debates raged over labor, race, and the scope of government. The nation was poised for global influence, but also poised to confront internal inequalities that would define much of the century ahead. The first decades of the 20th century were a time of dizzying change. Cities seemed to grow overnight. Streets pulsed with electricity, automobiles, and the chatter of radios. The United States had emerged as a global power, yet much of its population still lived precariously, navigating the divide between prosperity and poverty. And then came 1914, when the war in Europe, soon to be called the Great War, shifted the world in ways few Americans foresaw. At first, the U.S. tried to stay neutral, but industry, trade, and ideology eventually pulled the nation into conflict. Soldiers were drafted from every corner of the country, from immigrant neighborhoods in New York to small farms in Kansas. For many, war was terrifyingly immediate. Trenches filled with mud, rats, disease, and constant shelling, while letters home carried both bravado and despair. African American soldiers who served in segregated units like the Harlem Hellfighters faced prejudice at home and abroad, yet they distinguished themselves in battle, challenging prevailing notions of race and citizenship. Women stepped into roles left vacant by men, working in factories, driving ambulances, and running farms, yet their contributions were often minimized in official accounts. When the war ended in 1918, the country hoped for peace, but the 1918 influenza pandemic reminded Americans that nature could be as deadly as human conflict. Tens of millions worldwide perished, and in the United States, entire communities were decimated. Schools, hospitals, and homes were overwhelmed. Newspapers focused on war victories, yet stories of families wiped out by disease were rarely preserved in national memory.
The 1920s followed, a decade often remembered for jazz, flappers, and prohibition, yet beneath the surface lay stark contradictions. Cities hummed with nightlife and innovation, but rural areas wrestled with poverty and social anxiety. Prohibition, intended to curb alcohol consumption, instead fueled organized crime. Figures like Al Capone became infamous, not just for wealth, but for the violence and corruption that swept through urban life. Immigration restrictions, like the Immigration Act of 1924, reflected deep-seated anxieties about race, ethnicity, and national identity. While some Americans reveled in the promises of modernity, others feared it, creating cultural clashes that schools rarely explore in depth. Meanwhile, the economy roared, but only for some. Speculation, stock manipulation, and unchecked lending created the illusion of endless prosperity. Ordinary people invested life savings in stocks, dreaming of wealth, while banks and financial institutions quietly absorbed risk. When the crash came in 1929, it wasn't just numbers on Wall Street that fell. It was homes, farms, businesses, and families' very sense of security. Millions lost jobs, and entire communities became dependent on breadlines and charity. Yet even during this crisis, Americans showed resilience. Migrant families traveled the country in search of work, often facing prejudice and hostility. The Dust Bowl compounded misery for farming communities, forcing large-scale migration westward, particularly to California, where labor markets were overcrowded and exploitation rampant. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal promised relief, recovery, and reform, and it reshaped the relationship between the federal government and ordinary citizens. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, Works Progress Administration, and Social Security brought hope, employment, and infrastructure to the nation. Yet these programs were unevenly applied. Segregation in the South meant African Americans and Native Americans often received less aid. Women's work, especially unpaid domestic labor, remained undervalued. Unions and labor activism grew, and struggles over wages, working conditions, and civil rights set the stage for broader social movements later in the century. Then came the looming shadow of another global conflict. World War II began in Europe in 1939, and the United States initially tried to maintain neutrality. Yet the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, brought the war home with sudden, terrifying immediacy. Soldiers were drafted, women entered factories in unprecedented numbers as Rosie the Riveters, and entire communities were transformed. Yet the story often told in schools omits the human cost. Fear of bombings, rationing, internment of Japanese Americans, and the pressure on families to contribute to the war effort in ways both visible and invisible. Japanese internment camps like Manzanar housed tens of thousands of Americans of Japanese descent, many of them U.S. citizens, under harsh conditions. Families lived behind barbed wire, schools were makeshift, and the trauma of displacement reverberated for generations. Meanwhile, African Americans faced double V challenges: victory abroad against fascism and at home against racism. Segregated military units, limited opportunities, and pervasive discrimination shaped their wartime experience, even as they contributed heroically on battlefields from Europe to the Pacific. The Holocaust and other atrocities abroad also challenged Americans' understanding of morality, justice, and global responsibility. Soldiers, journalists, and ordinary citizens bore witness to horrors that defied comprehension. Returning veterans carried memories of destruction, trauma, and heroism, shaping post-war society in ways that textbooks often reduced to statistics or simplified narratives. By 1945, the war had ended, leaving the United States ascendant on the global stage. Cities were thriving, industry boomed, and the Cold War loomed, but the country faced enormous challenges at home. Racial segregation persisted, women who had worked in factories were often pushed out of jobs, and veterans returned to a society that had not fully reckoned with inequality. The post-war boom was real, but it was not universal. African Americans, Native Americans, and immigrants often remained marginalized, setting the stage for civil rights struggles that would define the next several decades. The guns had fallen silent, the world exhausted from years of conflict, yet the United States entered a new era paradox. The 1950s promised prosperity. Suburbs expanded, highways stretched across the nation, television brought images of wealth and consumerism into living rooms. On paper, America seemed unified, secure, and thriving. But beneath the neat lawns and cookie-cutter homes were tensions, contradictions, and struggles that schools rarely emphasize. For African Americans, segregation remained a daily reality. Separate and equal was a legal fiction, one that meant underfunded schools, limited economic opportunity, and constant social intimidation. Families in the South lived under Jim Crow laws, facing violence and systemic discrimination that shaped every aspect of life, from where children could sit in school to which restaurants and hospitals were accessible. Activists risked imprisonment, assault, or even death to challenge this system, yet their stories often exist in the margins of history textbooks. Figures like Rosa Parks, beyond the iconic bus protest, were part of a broader network of organizers, strategists, and community leaders fighting decades of oppression. Meanwhile, the Cold War created a national atmosphere of fear, conformity, and suspicion. McCarthyism cast long shadows, with people losing jobs and reputations over real or imagined associations with communism. Schools emphasized patriotism, yet students rarely learned how civil liberties were curtailed in the name of security. Nuclear drills, ducking under desks in classrooms, became a symbol of anxiety, a ritual both surreal and terrifying, hinting at a world in which survival might be measured in minutes rather than decades.
The 1960s exploded these tensions into open confrontation and transformative change. Civil rights protests, sit-ins, and marches forced the nation to confront systemic injustice. The Freedom Riders, often young and risking everything, rode buses through the South to challenge segregation, facing beatings and arrests. The March on Washington in 1963 was more than a photo op. It was a culmination of tireless local activism, organizing, and grassroots courage. Malcolm X's speeches challenged complacency, insisting that justice required bold action, even when uncomfortable. And while Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership remains widely celebrated, he was only one voice among many in a complex, multi-layered movement that included labor activists, women's groups, and ordinary citizens whose names were rarely recorded in textbooks. Meanwhile, the Vietnam War transformed American consciousness. Soldiers drafted from small towns, urban neighborhoods, and immigrant communities faced not only the horrors of combat, but also a country increasingly divided over the legitimacy of the conflict. Anti-war protests swept campuses and cities, sometimes escalating into violent confrontations with authorities. Television brought the war into living rooms in real time. Images of bombings, protests, and suffering that shocked the nation. Yet the stories of Vietnamese civilians who endured displacement, loss, and trauma were largely absent from the American narrative. Similarly, returning veterans often faced neglect, misunderstanding, and PTSD, challenging the simplistic narratives of heroism often taught in schools. The late 1960s and 1970s also saw a revolution in culture, gender, and social norms. The feminist movement gained momentum, challenging systemic inequality in workplaces, education, and politics. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique gave voice to frustrations many women had long felt, the expectation to find fulfillment solely in domestic roles, even as the world offered new opportunities. Simultaneously, LGBTQ+ activism began to emerge more publicly, culminating in events like the Stonewall Riots of 1969. These movements revealed that freedom in America had always been conditional, and that the fight for civil rights extended far beyond racial justice. At the same time, the environmental movement began to awaken public awareness. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring exposed the hidden costs of pesticides, highlighting the consequences of industrial progress on both ecosystems and human health. Urbanization, pollution, and corporate negligence sparked activism that forced the government and citizens alike to reconsider humanity's relationship with the natural world, a conversation schools often reduce to a single Earth Day paragraph. By the 1980s, America had become both a global powerhouse and a nation grappling with contradictions at home. Economic policies favored deregulation and wealth accumulation, but inequality persisted and grew in many communities. Technological advances, from personal computers to satellite communications, reshaped daily life, yet access remained uneven. Urban decay, racial tension, and economic displacement were realities for millions living outside the suburban ideal often portrayed in textbooks. Meanwhile, popular culture, from music to television to literature, reflected and challenged these social dynamics, offering commentary that historians are only beginning to fully analyze. Even geopolitically, the United States' role was complex and often morally ambiguous. Interventions in Central America, support for proxy wars during the Cold War, and global economic policies reflected power, influence, and sometimes exploitation. Soldiers and civilians alike bore the consequences of decisions made far from the front lines, shaping lives and communities in ways rarely addressed in school curricula. By the 1990s, America faced a rapidly changing world. The end of the Cold War, the rise of the Internet, and growing diversity in population and culture. Yet the legacies of systemic racism, economic inequality, and contested civil rights remained. Ordinary Americans navigated these challenges quietly and creatively through grassroots activism, entrepreneurship, community building, and cultural innovation. Stories of resilience, adaptation, and resistance from this era often remain overshadowed by narratives of progress, yet they are the lifeblood of the nation's ongoing history. The dawn of the 21st century arrived with optimism, technology humming quietly beneath daily life. The Internet had transformed how people communicated, learned, and conducted business. Cell phones shrank distances, while social media, still in its infancy, would soon amplify voices that had long been ignored. Yet beneath this promise of connection, the United States grappled with deep structural inequalities, questions of power, and a world growing smaller yet more complex. September 11, 2001 changed everything. On that clear Tuesday morning, ordinary Americans, office workers, firefighters, students, commuters were thrust into history. The attacks themselves were catastrophic, but their ripple effects reshaped politics, civil liberties, and foreign policy for decades. In the immediate aftermath, patriotism surged, yet schools rarely emphasized the nuanced consequences. The rise of surveillance programs, the stigmatization of Muslim and Arab Americans, and the complex geopolitical entanglements that followed. Families were torn not only by grief but by fear,
as communities struggled to reconcile a sense of national pride with the moral and human questions of war abroad. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq exposed another layer of untold history. Soldiers deployed overseas endured not only combat, but bureaucratic neglect, ambiguous missions, and the strain of repeated tours. Veterans returning home faced PTSD, homelessness, and insufficient mental health care, challenges often invisible in textbooks' broad narratives. Civilian populations abroad endured displacement, loss of infrastructure, and the uncertainty of living amid conflict. These wars were not simply about freedom or democracy. They were also about geopolitics, oil strategic positioning, and unintended consequences that affected millions far from American shores.
Meanwhile, at home, social movements were entering a new era. Black Lives Matter emerged in response to systemic police violence and entrenched racial inequities, highlighting the continuity of struggles that began centuries earlier. Indigenous activists fought against pipelines threatening sacred lands, drawing attention to centuries of broken treaties and environmental exploitation. Women's marches, LGBTQ+ advocacy, and campaigns for immigrant rights revealed that democracy was still a work in progress, shaped by ordinary people demanding recognition, justice, and equality. These movements are part of the same historical continuum that includes abolitionists, suffragists, civil rights leaders, and labor activists, yet they also reflect a modern landscape transformed by technology, media, and global interconnectedness. Economic upheavals punctuated this period as well. The 2008 financial crisis exposed the fragility of an interconnected global economy. Families lost homes, pensions, and savings, while financial institutions received government bailouts, sparking outrage and protest. Ordinary Americans, from farmers to factory workers to office employees, felt betrayed by systems designed to serve the wealthy and powerful. Grassroots movements, from Occupy Wall Street to local credit unions, challenged assumptions about economic fairness, exposing inequities that textbooks often gloss over. Technological revolutions accelerated social change, bringing both promise and peril. Smartphones, social media platforms, and instant communication created unprecedented access to information, but also misinformation, polarization, and surveillance. Citizens discovered that the tools meant to empower them could also be used to manipulate, control, and divide. The story of contemporary America is not only one of innovation, but of ethical, cultural, and political choices unfolding in real time. The nation's cultural fabric continued to evolve. Immigration diversified communities, reshaping cuisine, music, literature, and language. Cities became mosaics of cultures, identities, and experiences that schools often reduced to statistics. Stories of immigrant entrepreneurship, adaptation, and resistance illuminate a critical truth. America has always been, and continues to be, a nation defined by the people who arrive, survive, and contribute, even in the face of systemic barriers. Environmental crises, from hurricanes to wildfires, have become inseparable from contemporary American life. Communities across the country, coastal towns, rural heartlands, and urban centers face the direct consequences of climate change, pollution, and industrial neglect. Indigenous knowledge, historically dismissed, has often provided crucial strategies for adaptation and resilience, reminding the nation that survival sometimes depends on listening to voices long silenced. Today, the story of America is both triumph and tension, continuity and change. Technology connects us, yet inequality persists. Social movements challenge injustice, yet progress is uneven. Ordinary Americans navigate the legacies of slavery, segregation, labor struggle, wars, and displacement, even as they shape new communities, innovate, and fight for recognition. Textbooks provide dates, treaties, and battles, but the full texture, the fears, hopes, contradictions, and resilience of ordinary people is often absent.
The history of America is not a tidy narrative of uninterrupted progress. It is messy, complicated, and often uncomfortable. It is a story of survival, resistance, and reinvention. It is a story where the so-called invisible people, women, people of color, immigrants, indigenous communities, laborers, dissenters, and ordinary citizens have shaped the nation as profoundly as presidents, generals, or industrial magnates. And it is a story still being written every day by the lives and choices of the people who inhabit this vast, contested, extraordinary land. Imagine standing on the jagged shore of Jamestown in the sweltering summer of 1607. The air is thick with salt, decay, and human sweat, and the dense forests beyond the river seem alive, whispering secrets you are not meant to hear. You are one of the first English settlers in a place that will eventually become America, yet every breath reminds you that survival is a question, not a certainty. What you aren't told in history class is that Jamestown teetered on the brink of collapse for years, ravaged not only by famine and disease, but also by poor leadership, hidden rivalries, and deadly misunderstandings with the Powhatan people. Starvation was so severe in 1609 to 1610 that desperate settlers resorted to cannibalism, a grim reality often omitted from sanitized textbooks. Yet Jamestown was only the first glimpse of a pattern that would repeat itself across the continent, European ambition colliding with indigenous cultures, forging a society born of brilliance, brutality, and contradiction. Powhatan was no mere victim, he was a strategist, navigating diplomacy and war to protect his people in a world rapidly being claimed by outsiders. Meanwhile, settlers struggled not only against the land, but also against each other. Rivalries, broken promises, and greed shaped every decision as much as survival instincts did. Across the colonies, survival and ambition intertwined in complex ways. Plymouth Colony, mythologized for Thanksgiving and pious perseverance, faced starvation, epidemics, and cultural collisions with the Wampanoag people. The Mayflower Compact is remembered as a democratic milestone, yet it was a pragmatic agreement among men desperate to maintain order in a harsh, unfamiliar world. The northern colonies, meanwhile, cultivated rigid societies where dissent could mean exile or execution. The Salem witch trials, for example, were not merely about superstition. They were fueled by social tension, economic anxiety, and generational rivalry. Fear and power were inseparable in early New England.
Labor systems in the colonies were equally complicated. Indentured servitude and early slavery were both brutal and exploitative, shaping economies and social hierarchies. African men and women arrived in chains as early as 1619 in Virginia, and while the legal codification of slavery took decades, the reality of oppression was immediate. Resistance, both subtle and overt, was constant. Enslaved people learned to navigate the system, sabotage it, and, when possible, escape it. These stories of courage, ingenuity, and defiance are largely absent from traditional narratives. By the mid-18th century, tensions had evolved from survival to political contention. The colonies began experimenting with self-governance, creating committees, town meetings, and militias that allowed ordinary people a voice. Yet life was far from stable. Economic inequality, disputes over land, and pressure from imperial authorities created a simmering unrest that would explode into revolution. When the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775, they did so in a landscape as chaotic as it was hopeful. Families, neighbors, and towns were divided between loyalists and rebels. Ordinary men, armed with plow handles and hunting rifles, faced confusion and fear as much as courage. Across the colonies, women, African Americans, and Native Americans played vital, often overlooked roles in sustaining the rebellion. The Declaration of Independence immortalized certain figures, but countless others, spies, laborers, soldiers, and civic organizers, shaped the revolutionary struggle just as profoundly.
The Revolutionary War was a crucible that tested not only military strategy, but also the human spirit. Valley Forge and other campaigns revealed the endurance, suffering, and determination required to maintain a fledgling nation. Diplomats like Benjamin Franklin engaged in covert operations abroad, while soldiers faced hunger, disease, and frostbite at home. Native Americans were caught between imperial powers, often facing displacement or forced alliances. African Americans navigated complex choices, seeking freedom wherever opportunity presented itself. Independence was won, yet the task of building a nation had only begun. The Articles of Confederation revealed the fragility of loose alliances, and the Constitutional Convention of 1787 became a heated negotiation of power, morality, and compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise, the marginalization of women, and the tension between federal and state authority were emblematic of a nation wrestling with its ideals while accommodating entrenched inequalities. As the nation expanded, so did its contradictions. Westward expansion brought settlers into violent conflict with Native Americans, displaced indigenous communities, and created opportunities for both innovation and exploitation. The invention of the cotton gin in the South expanded slavery dramatically, while industrialization in the North created immense wealth for some and extreme poverty for others. Labor movements, immigration, and urbanization shaped new social dynamics, challenging notions of freedom and equality. By the mid-19th century, tensions erupted into civil war. The war was not a tidy battle between two uniform sides. It was a chaotic, bloody human experience. Soldiers endured hunger, disease, and amputations. Civilians faced destruction and displacement, and enslaved people resisted, escaped, and sought to claim the freedom they had long been denied. The Emancipation Proclamation, while transformative, was also a strategic act of war. Reconstruction attempted to codify freedom, yet it was undermined by violence, racism, and political compromise. The Gilded Age followed, dazzling in wealth and industry, but rife with inequality and labor exploitation. Immigrants faced harsh conditions in factories and tenements, children labored in mills, and women fought for recognition in public life. Indigenous communities faced boarding schools designed to erase language and culture, while social reformers pushed for labor rights, environmental protections, and political change. The 20th century brought global conflict, economic upheaval, and social transformation. World War I and II reshaped society, the role of women, and the status of African Americans. The Great Depression exposed economic fragility, prompting sweeping reforms under the New Deal. Civil rights movements challenged entrenched injustice, while anti-war activism, feminism, environmentalism, and LGBTQ+ advocacy transformed cultural landscapes. The 21st century continues to reflect the same patterns: inequality, resilience, and the ongoing struggle for justice. 9/11 reshaped national consciousness. Wars abroad tested the nation's ethics, and social movements, Black Lives Matter, indigenous rights activism, and women's marches remind us that democracy is a work in progress. Technological revolutions, immigration, and environmental crises continue to redefine what it means to be American. From Jamestown to the present, the story of America is messy, human, and extraordinary. It is not a linear tale of inevitable progress, but a tapestry of contradictions, courage, failure, and reinvention. Ordinary people, enslaved and free, native and immigrant, soldier and activist, have shaped this nation as profoundly as its presidents and generals, and their stories, often absent from textbooks, are the threads that hold the true history of America together.
Imagine landing on the shores of Jamestown in 1607. The heat is suffocating, the marshes hum with mosquitoes, and the air smells of salt, rot, and fear. You were among 104 English settlers, gentlemen, laborers, and a handful of craftsmen sent by the Virginia Company to establish a colony in the name of profit, prestige, and empire. Few textbooks reveal the day-to-day terror of these early colonists. Many expected fertile fields and untold riches. Instead, they found brackish water, hostile terrain, and the complex reality of interacting with the Powhatan Confederacy, a sophisticated and powerful indigenous society that had thrived for centuries. Life in Jamestown was brutal. Disease, malaria, dysentery, typhoid struck with devastating speed. Food was scarce, and the starving time of 1609 to 1610 drove settlers to desperate acts, including cannibalism. Captain John Smith, whose later legend paints him as the fearless adventurer, survived multiple assassination attempts and internal political intrigue. Beneath his adventures lay a colony constantly teetering on the edge of collapse. And yet, Jamestown endured, thanks in part to trade with the Powhatan people, the hard labor of settlers, and the eventual arrival of supply ships that kept the fragile settlement alive. Jamestown also marked the beginning of systems that would define America: labor hierarchies, land exploitation, and racialized oppression. Indentured servitude brought poor Europeans who exchanged years of labor for passage to the New World, often enduring harsh treatment. African men and women arrived in chains as early as 1619, planting the seeds of chattel slavery that would expand dramatically in the centuries to come. Resistance was constant. Enslaved people sabotaged crops, fled plantations, and maintained cultural traditions that defied the dehumanization around them, a story often absent from early American histories. Across New England, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in 1620, seeking religious freedom. The story of the Mayflower Compact is familiar, but the reality was far less idyllic. Early winters killed nearly half the settlers, forcing survivors to rely on native allies like the Wampanoag. Squanto, who had been kidnapped and enslaved in Europe before returning to Massachusetts, became an intermediary, teaching survival skills and navigating diplomacy between cultures. Thanksgiving, so often sanitized as a cheerful harvest festival, masks a complex history of negotiation, survival, and cultural encounter. Meanwhile, the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay Colony created tightly controlled communities, enforcing moral codes that regulated behavior, education, and religion. Dissent was dangerous. The Salem witch trials of 1692 are often taught as a cautionary tale of superstition, yet they were also fueled by property disputes, generational tension, and political factionalism. Women and men accused of witchcraft were not merely victims of mass hysteria. They were enmeshed in networks of rivalry and fear, reflecting a society under intense social pressure. Life in the colonies varied widely depending on geography, economy, and culture. In the South, plantations grew tobacco, rice, and indigo, relying heavily on enslaved labor. Families of wealth and influence built grand homes, but the human cost was immense. In the North, trade, small farms, and emerging towns created a different rhythm of life, with craft industries, ports, and local governance shaping daily experiences. Across the continent, communities faced epidemics, famine, and conflict, both internal and with native populations, revealing that survival was a shared and precarious endeavor. Education, too, was selective. Wealthy boys might learn Latin, Greek, and philosophy. Most children, including girls and enslaved youth, were excluded from formal learning. Yet ordinary people found ways to educate themselves, create networks of knowledge, and participate in civic life. Town meetings, local militias, and apprenticeship systems allowed colonists to exercise agency, negotiate power, and shape their societies long before independence was declared. By the mid-18th century, tension with Britain was rising.
Colonists increasingly resisted taxes, trade restrictions, and laws imposed without representation. The Boston Tea Party of 1773, often depicted as a daring act of patriotism, was part of a broader landscape of resistance that included boycotts, petitions, and everyday acts of defiance. Ordinary citizens, merchants, artisans, women managing households, and enslaved people watching the unfolding struggle lived in a world where political action carried real consequences, from economic ruin to imprisonment. The Revolutionary War erupted in 1775, igniting conflicts across the colonies. Lexington and Concord, often portrayed as organized military engagements, were chaotic skirmishes where panic, confusion, and improvisation dictated outcomes as much as bravery. Militias composed of ordinary men, farmers, craftsmen, laborers, faced professional British soldiers, while families endured the uncertainty of survival, displacement, and the constant threat of violence. Native Americans were caught in the crossfire, making strategic alliances with both sides in an effort to protect their communities. African Americans navigated choices fraught with risk, joining the fight in hopes of freedom that was uncertain and unevenly promised. The Declaration of Independence, penned in 1776, captured ideals that were not universally applied. While it proclaimed liberty, equality, and rights, women, enslaved people, and Native Americans were excluded from its protections. Figures like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams labored to navigate diplomacy, while George Washington faced a logistical nightmare: underpaid troops, supply shortages, and the threat of mutiny. Behind every historical victory lay countless untold stories of struggle, courage, and moral complexity. The war was won, but victory did not immediately translate to stability. The fledgling United States faced a daunting question: how could 13 disparate colonies, each with its own interests, histories, and fears, be bound together under a single government? The Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, were a fragile experiment in decentralized power. States jealously guarded authority, trade disputes erupted, and soldiers who had risked life and limb during the Revolution were often unpaid and ignored. The new nation was a patchwork of hope and tension, its survival anything but guaranteed.
By 1787, the Constitutional Convention convened in Philadelphia. The delegates, sequestered behind closed doors, wrestled with profound questions. How much power should the federal government have? How would representation be determined? What place would slavery occupy in the new nation? The resulting Constitution was not the embodiment of universal liberty it is sometimes portrayed as in classrooms. It was a carefully negotiated compromise, balancing competing regional, economic, and political interests. The infamous 3/5 compromise, which partially counted enslaved people for representation while denying them freedom, revealed that justice and morality were already being sacrificed for political expediency. Women were excluded entirely from the political process, and native nations were not consulted, even as their lands were being claimed by the new government. The debates surrounding ratification were intense. Federalists, including Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, published the Federalist Papers to persuade citizens of the need for a strong central government. Anti-Federalists feared concentrated power and warned that the Constitution endangered liberty for ordinary people. Pamphlets flew across the colonies, newspapers published fiery editorials, and ordinary citizens, farmers, merchants, laborers, argued passionately about the nation's future. It was democracy in its messy human form, full of persuasion, fear, and idealism. Meanwhile, the early republic faced immediate challenges. George Washington, the first president, set precedents that would shape the office for generations: neutrality in foreign conflicts, the peaceful transfer of power, and a commitment to balancing federal authority with state rights. Yet his administration faced rebellion at home. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 revealed the fragility of federal authority. Farmers in western Pennsylvania resisted a federal excise tax, leading Washington to deploy troops to quell the unrest. The incident demonstrated that freedom was not a guarantee of chaos-free protest. The new nation demanded negotiation, compromise, and enforcement. Westward expansion began in earnest during this period, driven by ambition, population growth, and economic opportunity. Settlers moved into the Ohio Valley, Kentucky, and beyond, often displacing native communities through treaties that were coercive at best and outright fraudulent at worst. Figures like Daniel Boone became legendary, not only for exploring uncharted wilderness, but also for embodying the tension between opportunity and conquest. These expeditions were perilous, requiring survival skills, negotiation with indigenous nations, and resilience against disease, starvation, and the unknown. At the same time, the nation confronted the moral and political dilemmas of slavery. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made cotton highly profitable, intensifying the demand for enslaved labor in the South. Northern states gradually abolished slavery, while the South entrenched it, creating a regional divide that would shape American politics, economics, and society for decades. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways, from subtle acts of defiance to organized escapes, and their courage and ingenuity were central to shaping the moral and political landscape, even if often absent from early histories. International events also shaped the early republic. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the size of the nation, opening vast new territories for settlement, but also raising questions about governance, native displacement, and the expansion of slavery. Lewis and Clark's expedition mapped these lands, documented wildlife, and interacted with indigenous communities, creating a record that was as much about asserting American claims as it was about exploration. Meanwhile, conflicts with Britain and France tested the young nation's neutrality and economic resilience, leading to the War of 1812, which confirmed American independence but exposed the fragility of infrastructure, defense, and diplomacy. By the 1820s and 1830s, America was a nation in motion. Population growth, technological innovation, and social change created opportunities and challenges. Canals, roads, and eventually railroads connected distant regions, fueling commerce and migration. Cities grew, factories proliferated, and immigration from Europe reshaped urban life. Yet inequality persisted. Laborers, many of them immigrants, endured grueling hours, low pay, and dangerous working conditions. Women, especially in factories, faced harassment and exclusion from civic life. Social reformers began advocating for public education, temperance, and labor rights, planting seeds for movements that would mature in the later 19th century. Simultaneously, the frontier remained a site of opportunity and conflict. Native Americans were forced onto reservations through coercion, violence, and broken treaties. Some resisted, like the Seminoles in Florida or the Sauk under Black Hawk, while others adapted to imposed structures, preserving language, culture, and governance in the face of relentless pressure. These stories highlight a recurring pattern. American expansion was never a simple tale of progress. It was messy, contested, and deeply human.
The early 19th century was also marked by political evolution. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, championed agrarian values and limited federal government, while Federalists promoted commerce, centralized authority, and strong ties with Britain. Elections became more participatory, yet still excluded women, most African Americans, and Native populations. Debates over tariffs, infrastructure, and states' rights reflected a nation still defining what it meant to be American. The first half of the 19th century was a time of restless energy, invention, and deep contradictions. Imagine the Ohio Valley in the 1820s.
rivers winding like silver ribbons through forests, settlers building log cabins on soil that had sustained native nations for generations, and the distant sound of gunfire from territorial disputes blending with the calls of wildlife. Westward expansion was celebrated in textbooks as a triumph of pioneering spirit, but the reality was far more complicated. Native Americans were being displaced, treaties were coerced or ignored, and violence, sometimes large-scale, sometimes intimate, marked nearly every settlement. In the South, cotton was king. The invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1793 had transformed agriculture, making the crop wildly profitable and embedding the brutal institution of slavery even deeper into the economy. Plantations stretched across the landscape, producing wealth for a small elite while enslaving hundreds of thousands of people. Families were torn apart, individuals resisted through subtle sabotage or escape, and the psychological toll was immense. Figures like Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Denmark Vesey were not anomalies. They were part of a continuum of resistance that shaped the nation's moral and political trajectory. At the same time, the North was industrializing rapidly. Factories, canals, and railroads created new opportunities, but also harsh labor conditions. Children worked long hours, women toiled in textile mills under strict supervision, and immigrants faced hostility and exploitation. Cities swelled with newcomers, creating vibrant communities, but also overcrowding, disease, and social tension. The tension between an industrializing North and a slave-dependent South was not abstract. It affected every political debate, every newspaper editorial, and every ordinary person's life. Social reform movements emerged in response to these pressures. Abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Theodore Weld risked violence and public ostracism to challenge slavery. Women's rights activists, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, began organizing conventions to demand suffrage, education, and legal equality. The temperance movement sought to curb alcohol consumption, linking moral reform to broader visions of social improvement. Many of these movements overlapped, intersecting with labor rights, education reform, and Native American advocacy. Yet their stories are often fragmented in textbooks, even though they were central to the social dynamism of the period. Politics in the antebellum period were increasingly dominated by the question of slavery's expansion. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to balance free and slave states, yet it was only a temporary solution to a growing national crisis. Newspapers, pamphlets, and public speeches carried passionate, often radical rhetoric on both sides of the debate. Ordinary citizens, from farmers to urban workers, were drawn into these conflicts, sometimes participating directly through rallies, petitions, and local governance. In the 1830s and 1840s saw the rise of a distinctly American spirit of reform and experimentation. The Second Great Awakening, a wave of religious revival, inspired moral crusades, educational reform, and communal living experiments. Figures like Dorothea Dix campaigned for the humane treatment of the mentally ill, while Horace Mann championed public education as a tool for civic virtue. At the same time, utopian communities such as Brook Farm and New Harmony attempted to live out ideals of equality, cooperation, and shared labor, offering glimpses of alternative social orders, even if many were short-lived. Westward expansion continued to redefine the nation. The Texas Revolution, the annexation of Texas, and the Mexican-American War brought new territories into the United States, intensifying debates over whether slavery would extend into these lands. Soldiers, settlers, and civilians alike faced the harsh realities of travel, disease, and conflict. Diaries from the period reveal families navigating rivers, forests, and deserts, negotiating with native nations, and confronting unpredictable violence and weather. The Louisiana Purchase had opened new possibilities. By mid-century, Manifest Destiny became a rallying cry that combined ambition, ideology, and often ruthless conquest. As sectional tensions grew, everyday life in both North and South reflected the deep divisions. Communities debated moral and economic questions at local levels, with churches, schools, and newspapers shaping public opinion. African Americans in the North faced legal discrimination and limited economic opportunities, even as they joined abolitionist societies and escaped enslaved people via the Underground Railroad. In the South, enslaved populations quietly resisted their condition, developing networks of communication, covert education, and escape routes. Ordinary citizens, white and black, free and enslaved, lived at the intersection of moral, economic, and political crises, setting the stage for the coming national rupture. By the 1850s, the country was teetering. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 forced free Northern citizens to comply with the capture of escaped enslaved people, turning ordinary households into moral dilemma and often direct resistance. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 unleashed violence in the territories, with pro- and anti-slavery settlers clashing in Bleeding Kansas. Newspapers sensationalized events, while pamphleteers spread fiery rhetoric that reached rural farmers, urban workers, and ordinary citizens alike. Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer and politician in Illinois, began to emerge as a voice navigating the nation's growing moral and political crisis.
By 1860, the election of Lincoln, without carrying a single Southern state, ignited secessionist fury. South Carolina and other Southern states claimed the right to leave a union they said no longer represented them. Behind political rhetoric, the stakes were human. Enslaved families faced uncertain futures. Communities were divided, and ordinary Americans braced for the possibility of conflict on a scale they could scarcely imagine. The Civil War that erupted in 1861 was chaotic, devastating, and profoundly human. Battles were not orderly. They were moments of terror, improvisation, and sheer endurance. Soldiers endured frostbite, hunger, disease, and the constant presence of death. Civilians saw homes burned, crops destroyed, and communities fractured. Enslaved people seized the chaos as an opportunity for escape, sabotage, and survival, while Northern and Southern populations grappled with the moral, political, and personal consequences of conflict. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 shifted the war's moral compass, making the abolition of slavery an explicit goal of the Union. African American soldiers, often underpaid and discriminated against, proved their valor in battles like Fort Wagner and beyond, challenging entrenched ideas of race and citizenship. By the war's end in 1865, slavery had been abolished, but Reconstruction revealed the fragility of freedom. Freed people sought land, education, and political power, while white supremacist groups waged terror campaigns to undermine progress. The struggle for equality had only begun, and its lessons would reverberate across generations. The guns fell silent in 1865, leaving the nation battered, divided, and exhausted. Cities were smoldering, plantations were abandoned or destroyed, and the social fabric of the South had been torn apart. Yet, amid the devastation lay the fragile promise of Reconstruction, a period in which formerly enslaved people sought to claim freedom in every aspect of life: land, education, political participation, and family reunification. Freed people built schools, churches, and communities, often with support from Northern missionaries and organizations like the Freedmen's Bureau. These institutions were more than buildings. They were symbols of hope and resilience, spaces where people reclaimed identity, knowledge, and dignity. Yet every step toward equality was met with resistance. White supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan waged terror campaigns, targeting leaders, teachers, and families in efforts to maintain control through fear. Violence, intimidation, and legal loopholes undermined progress, showing that freedom could be fragile,
contingent, and contested. Politics during Reconstruction was both revolutionary and contentious. African Americans were elected to local, state, and national office, participating in a political system that had long denied them voice. Figures like Hiram Revels, Blanche K. Bruce, and Robert Smalls navigated hostile legislatures and relentless opposition to advocate for public education, labor rights, and civil protections. At the same time, the federal government struggled to enforce new amendments and laws in a South determined to reassert white supremacy. By the late 1870s, federal troops withdrew, and the era of Reconstruction gave way to the Jim Crow system, a stark reminder that legal freedom did not guarantee social equality. As the South retreated into segregation, the North and Midwest surged forward into the Gilded Age. Railroads stitched the continent together, factories hummed with machinery, and cities expanded faster than governments could regulate. Entrepreneurs like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, and John D. Rockefeller amassed fortunes that were staggering in scale, shaping the economy and society in ways that still reverberate today. Yet beneath the glittering wealth lay a stark reality for laborers: 12 to 16-hour days, dangerous conditions, child labor, and tenuous wages. Strikes, riots, and labor organizing punctuated this period, yet schools rarely convey the human cost of industrial expansion. Immigration surged during the late 19th century, bringing millions from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and Eastern Europe. Ethnic neighborhoods arose, teeming with life, culture, and resilience, but also facing discrimination, overcrowding, and poverty. Chinese immigrants in particular were targeted by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, revealing the selective nature of American freedom. Many communities thrived through mutual aid societies, religious institutions, and cultural networks, yet their stories are often footnotes rather than central narratives. In the West, the frontier was closing, but the consequences of conquest remained vivid. Native Americans had been forcibly removed from ancestral lands and confined to reservations. Boarding schools sought to erase their languages and cultures, and wars like Little Bighorn and Wounded Knee symbolized the violent clash between federal power and indigenous survival. Yet Native communities resisted through storytelling, preservation of traditions, political activism, and adaptation, showing resilience that survives to this day. Social reform movements also emerged as a counterweight to inequality. Labor unions like the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor pushed for better wages, safer workplaces, and shorter hours. Women activists, often marginalized within these movements, advocated for suffrage, education, and labor protections. Figures like Mary Harris Mother Jones organized striking miners and championed children working in dangerous conditions. These stories highlight how ordinary people, not just presidents and industrialists, shaped the contours of American society. Meanwhile, technological innovation transformed daily life. Electricity, telegraphs, streetcars, and steam engines revolutionized cities and towns. Yet access was uneven. Rural areas, African American communities, and immigrants often benefited last. Newspapers and illustrated magazines helped create a shared national culture, spreading both ideas of progress and social prejudices. The Gilded Age was a period of striking contrasts: wealth and poverty, progress and oppression, hope and fear. Immigrants and laborers endured hardship, while industrial magnates built empires. Reformers pressed for justice, while entrenched power resisted change. These contradictions were not abstract, they were lived experiences, shaping families, neighborhoods, and communities.
By the turn of the 20th century, the United States stood at a crossroads. Global influence was expanding, industrial power was unmatched, and the promise of modernity was dazzling. Yet the nation's contradictions, racial injustice, economic inequality, labor exploitation, and gender exclusion remained unresolved. The stage was set for the social, political, and cultural upheavals that would define the Progressive Era, World War I, and the modern United States.
By the early 20th century, America was a nation on the move, buzzing with innovation, migration, and social change. Cities sprawled upward with steel skyscrapers and outward with streetcars connecting neighborhoods. Factories hummed with machinery, producing goods that would fill homes across the nation. Yet the laborers powering this growth often endured dangerous conditions and barely livable wages. Children worked long hours alongside adults. Women juggled factory labor with household responsibilities, and immigrants struggled to navigate a world that celebrated their labor while marginalizing their voices. Amid this industrial expansion, social reformers emerged to confront inequality and injustice. The Progressive Era, roughly spanning 1890 to 1920, was a time of experimentation, advocacy, and confrontation with entrenched power. Activists sought to regulate industry, reform politics, and address social ills such as child labor, unsafe working conditions, and political corruption. Figures like Jane Addams, founder of Hull House in Chicago, provided services and education to immigrants and the poor, creating spaces where ordinary people could learn, organize, and fight for better lives. Simultaneously, muckraking journalists exposed corporate greed and political corruption. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle shocked the nation with its depiction of meatpacking horrors, prompting food safety reforms. Ida B. Wells tirelessly documented lynching in the South, shining light on racial terror that newspapers and politicians ignored. These reformers risked public scorn, personal safety, and political backlash to tell stories that would otherwise remain hidden, shaping a national consciousness attuned to both injustice and possibility. The fight for women's suffrage gained momentum, culminating in the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Yet the struggle for equality extended far beyond the ballot. African American women, Native women, and immigrant women often faced both racial and gender discrimination, highlighting the limits of legal victories in transforming lived realities. Labor rights, educational access, and health care remained arenas of struggle, showing that social reform is rarely linear or complete. Meanwhile, the United States' role in the world was expanding. World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, initially far from American shores. Trade and political interests, however, drew the U.S. into the conflict by 1917. Soldiers, many drafted from rural towns and urban immigrant neighborhoods, faced trench warfare, disease, and psychological trauma. African American soldiers, largely relegated to segregated units like the Harlem Hellfighters, distinguished themselves on European battlefields, challenging racial prejudice even as discrimination persisted at home. Women stepped into jobs left vacant by men, working in factories, offices, and farms, demonstrating capabilities that society had long overlooked. The war left an indelible mark on the nation. The 1918 influenza pandemic compounded human suffering, killing millions worldwide and exposing public health vulnerabilities. Communities mourned countless losses, and returning soldiers grappled with physical injuries, psychological trauma, and reintegration into a society that was rapidly changing. The end of the war ushered in the Roaring Twenties, a decade remembered for jazz, flappers, speakeasies, and economic boom. Cities pulsed with nightlife, cultural innovation, and modernity, yet beneath the glamour lay contradictions. Rural communities often resisted cultural shifts, fearing moral decay and social upheaval. Prohibition, intended to curb alcohol consumption, instead fueled organized crime, corruption, and violence, with figures like Al Capone becoming infamous not merely for wealth, but for the fear and chaos their empires generated. Immigration restrictions, exemplified by the Immigration Act of 1924, reflected deep-seated anxieties about race, culture, and national identity. Labor unrest simmered as workers demanded fair wages, reasonable hours, and safer conditions. African Americans migrating north during the Great Migration sought economic opportunity while escaping the Jim Crow South, reshaping urban culture in cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit, yet encountering new forms of segregation and discrimination. By the decade's end, the illusion of endless prosperity was shattered. The stock market crash of 1929 plunged millions into poverty. Banks failed, savings vanished, and families faced hunger, unemployment, and displacement. The Great Depression revealed that the promise of modernity and capitalism was fragile, contingent, and deeply unequal. Communities adapted in creative ways. Migrant families traveled in search of work, neighbors shared scarce resources, and grassroots organizations stepped in where government aid was insufficient. The early 20th century teaches a recurring truth. American history is rarely linear, rarely tidy. Triumph and tragedy, progress and oppression, innovation and exploitation exist side by side. Ordinary people, workers, immigrants, women, African Americans, Native Americans, shaped the nation through resilience, creativity, and resistance in ways that official narratives overlook.
The autumn of 1929 brought more than falling stock prices. It brought a nation to its knees. The stock market crash signaled the beginning of the Great Depression, a period of profound economic collapse that would reshape the lives of millions. Cities once bustling with industry became landscapes of breadlines and shantytowns. Rural farms were ravaged not only by debt, but by ecological disaster, as the Dust Bowl stripped the Great Plains of soil, leaving families destitute and desperate. Children went hungry, parents traveled endlessly in search of work, and the social fabric of communities frayed under the strain. The government's initial response was hesitant and often inadequate, leaving ordinary Americans to fend for themselves. Yet amid suffering, resilience emerged. Communities created informal support networks, sharing food, shelter, and information. Migrant families, known as Okies and Arkies, traveled west to California, navigating treacherous roads, prejudice, and the uncertainty of temporary work in agriculture. Their journeys, chronicled in diaries, letters, and oral histories, reveal an America rarely reflected in school curricula, one of courage, improvisation, and survival on the margins. Franklin D. Roosevelt's election in 1932 offered a new vision. The New Deal, a series of federal programs and reforms, sought to provide relief, recovery, and reform. Jobs programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, WPA, employed millions, building roads, bridges, parks, and public buildings that still stand today. Social Security offered a safety net for the elderly, the unemployed, and the disabled. Yet the New Deal was not universally inclusive. Racial discrimination persisted, Native communities were marginalized, and women often received lower wages or were excluded from programs. Still, the era demonstrated the potential for government to intervene in the lives of ordinary people, shaping both opportunity and expectation. The 1930s were also a time of cultural flourishing despite hardship. Writers like John Steinbeck, through works such as The Grapes of Wrath, captured the plight of struggling families, while photographers like Dorothea Lange documented the human face of poverty. Music, theater, and folk traditions offered both escape and social commentary, reflecting the resilience and creativity of people confronting adversity. By the late 1930s, the world was again on the brink of catastrophe. Totalitarian regimes in Europe and Asia threatened global stability, and America faced the challenge of responding while still recovering from economic collapse. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, thrust the nation into World War II, transforming everyday life at home and abroad.
The war effort mobilized the entire country. Factories switched from consumer goods to military production, creating jobs and new opportunities for women and minorities. Rosie the Riveter became an iconic figure representing women's entry into industrial labor, yet many faced discrimination, unequal pay, and limited career advancement. African Americans and other minority groups also contributed to the war effort, both on the home front and in military service, even as segregation and racism persisted. Soldiers faced brutal realities overseas. In the Pacific, island-hopping campaigns exposed men to tropical disease, harsh terrain, and fierce combat against a determined enemy. In Europe, battles from Normandy to the Bulge demanded extraordinary courage and endurance, with soldiers enduring freezing winters, relentless artillery, and the constant threat of death. Ordinary people, civilians caught in occupied territories, resistance fighters, and families of soldiers navigated fear, uncertainty, and survival in ways textbooks rarely fully convey. The war also exposed moral and ethical dilemmas. The Holocaust revealed the depths of human cruelty, while strategic decisions, such as the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, left legacies of controversy that continue to provoke debate. Domestically, Japanese Americans were forcibly interned in camps under Executive Order 9066, a stark reminder that fear and prejudice could override constitutional rights, even in a nation fighting for freedom abroad. By 1945, victory came at immense human cost. Millions of lives had been lost, cities were destroyed, and entire regions were reshaped. Yet the United States emerged as a global superpower, its economy strengthened, and its influence unparalleled. The post-war era promised prosperity, technological innovation, and social transformation, but also confronted the nation with unresolved issues of inequality, civil rights, and global responsibility. The story of the Depression and World War II teaches a central lesson. Ordinary people, workers, soldiers, women, immigrants, and communities on the margins shaped history as much as presidents and generals. Their resilience, creativity, courage, and suffering formed the human core of America's narrative, revealing layers of experience often absent from traditional school histories. The guns of World War II had fallen silent, and the nation exhaled, but the challenges of rebuilding, reintegration, and redefining identity were immense. Soldiers returned home to crowded cities and booming suburbs, bringing both dreams and anxieties. The GI Bill promised education, home loans, and economic opportunity, yet its benefits were often distributed unevenly, leaving African American veterans and other marginalized groups at a disadvantage. Still, millions seized the opportunity to attend college, buy homes, and begin careers, fueling the growth of a prosperous middle class. The 1950s are often remembered for uniformity, white picket fences, drive-in diners, and the birth of the nuclear family. Yet beneath the veneer of prosperity and stability, contradictions simmered. African Americans in the South continued to face Jim Crow laws, disenfranchisement, and systemic violence. Native Americans struggled under policies that promoted relocation to cities, eroding traditional communities. Women who had gained economic roles during the war were pressured back into domesticity, their ambitions constrained by societal expectations. The suburbs, meanwhile, often relied on exclusionary practices, redlining, racially restrictive covenants that codified segregation, shaping the geography of inequality for generations.
The Cold War shaped politics, culture, and identity in profound ways. Fear of communism infiltrated public life, from the House Un-American Activities Committee investigating alleged subversives to everyday Americans adjusting behavior to avoid suspicion. McCarthyism silenced dissent, undermined careers, and instilled a pervasive sense of paranoia. Meanwhile, foreign policy was dominated by containment. Korea, Vietnam, and alliances with European nations reflected a nation asserting influence while negotiating the moral and human costs of intervention. Ordinary citizens, students, workers, soldiers, and families lived in a world where ideology, patriotism, and fear intertwined in complex ways. Civil rights movements gained momentum, forcing the nation to confront the moral gaps between its ideals and reality. Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her bus seat in Montgomery in 1955 sparked a boycott that transformed local protest into national action. Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference mobilized churches and communities, demonstrating the power of grassroots organization. Yet the story is richer than textbooks convey. Local activists, students, teachers, and clergy risked lives and livelihoods to challenge entrenched injustice. Sit-ins, freedom rides, voter registration drives, and marches were not abstract events. They were lived experiences of courage, strategy, and sacrifice. The struggle extended beyond the South. Northern cities faced de facto segregation in housing, schools, and employment. Native Americans, inspired by broader civil rights momentum, demanded sovereignty and recognition of treaty rights. Latinos and Asian Americans also organized for labor rights, educational access, and social justice, asserting their place in the narrative of American progress. These overlapping movements reveal a persistent truth. The fight for equality has always been multifaceted, inclusive, and ongoing. The 1960s and 1970s brought both triumphs and upheaval. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 codified legal protections, yet social and economic inequalities persisted. Anti-war movements, sparked by U.S. involvement in Vietnam, challenged government authority and public narratives, drawing students, clergy, and ordinary citizens into protest. Women's liberation campaigns, led by figures like Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem, challenged entrenched gender roles, advocating for workplace rights, reproductive freedom, and cultural recognition. Environmental activism, sparked by books like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, highlighted the growing awareness that human activity could imperil the natural world. Cultural transformations also reshaped daily life. Music, art, literature, and television became vehicles for both expression and resistance. The counterculture of the 1960s and early 1970s questioned authority, redefined social norms, and embraced experimentation, challenging previous generations' assumptions. Immigrant communities and youth culture brought diversity, energy, and new perspectives, highlighting the dynamic and contested nature of American identity. Internationally, the Cold War continued to shape events. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the nation to the brink of nuclear conflict, while interventions in Latin America, Africa, and Asia reflected strategic priorities, often at odds with professed ideals of democracy and self-determination. Ordinary Americans, students protesting nuclear testing, families sheltering in fallout drills, journalists reporting from foreign conflicts, experienced the era as one of tension, moral ambiguity, and global awareness. By the late 20th century, America was grappling with its contradictions: prosperity alongside inequality, freedom alongside repression, technological innovation alongside social dislocation. Civil rights victories had reshaped law and public discourse, yet systemic challenges persisted. Feminism, environmentalism, LGBTQ+ activism, and grassroots movements all signaled that the American story was unfinished, shaped by ordinary people claiming their voices and spaces in society. The 1980s and 1990s brought dramatic shifts in American life. Cities pulsed with energy as technology, media, and culture evolved at unprecedented speed. Personal computers began to appear in homes, transforming education, work, and entertainment.
Cable television brought a wider world into living rooms, while pop culture, from hip-hop in the Bronx to grunge in Seattle, gave voice to communities long ignored by mainstream narratives. Yet these decades were also marked by inequality. Inner cities faced economic decline, schools were underfunded, and marginalized communities bore the brunt of poverty, drug epidemics, and social neglect. The Cold War lingered until the late 1980s, its ideological struggle shaping foreign policy, military spending, and even daily life. Citizens lived with the constant, if sometimes abstract, threat of nuclear conflict. Meanwhile, foreign interventions, from Central America to the Middle East, demonstrated the complexities of U.S. power. Ordinary people often bore the consequences, whether as military families, immigrants fleeing conflict zones, or workers producing military equipment in industrial towns. As the 1990s progressed, globalization and technological innovation accelerated. The rise of the Internet and mobile communication transformed commerce, education, and personal connection. Jobs shifted, some disappearing in manufacturing, while others emerged in new sectors, creating both opportunity and anxiety. Immigrants and refugees contributed to these transformations, establishing businesses, communities, and cultural institutions, while facing legal barriers, discrimination, and social adjustment. Yet beneath the era's prosperity lay systemic challenges. Income inequality widened, rural communities struggled to maintain economic viability, and environmental concerns grew more urgent. Social movements continued to fight for recognition and rights. LGBTQ+ activism pressed for legal and cultural inclusion. Native American communities pursued sovereignty and cultural preservation, and grassroots organizations addressed urban poverty, educational access, and labor conditions. These efforts often unfolded quietly, outside the headlines, but they shaped the country's trajectory in profound ways. The attacks of September 11, 2001, shattered the sense of safety that many Americans had taken for granted. New York City, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania became symbols of tragedy, resilience, and the global reach of terrorism. Ordinary people, firefighters, police, first responders, commuters, and families experienced the event in both immediate and lasting. Beyond the headlines, communities organized relief efforts, supported victims' families, and navigated trauma, showing the human dimension of national catastrophe.
In the years that followed, the United States engaged in conflicts abroad, expanded domestic security measures, and faced the moral dilemmas inherent in a modern, globalized society. Technology accelerated rapidly, reshaping communication, economy, and culture. Social media emerged as a force capable of connecting communities, amplifying movements, and reshaping public discourse, but it also introduced new challenges: misinformation, polarization, and surveillance. Ordinary Americans navigated these changes, adapting their work, social interactions, and civic engagement in unprecedented ways. Cultural movements continued to redefine identity and justice. The Black Lives Matter movement confronted systemic racism and police violence, drawing national and global attention to issues long ignored by institutions and history books. Indigenous activists pursued land rights, environmental justice, and cultural preservation. Women and LGBTQ+ communities challenged inequities, advocating for equal pay, reproductive rights, and legal protections. Immigrant communities amplified their voices, contributing to economic growth, culture, and political life, while advocating for justice and inclusion. In the 21st century, the United States remains a nation of contradictions, complexity, and resilience. The economy is technologically advanced, but still marked by inequality. Global influence is unmatched, yet domestic challenges, racial injustice, environmental crises, political polarization, and public health persist. Ordinary people continue to shape the nation in ways that official narratives often overlook.
teachers innovating in underfunded schools, activists organizing local campaigns, scientists advancing understanding of climate change, families adapting to economic instability, and communities preserving traditions while embracing new identities. From Jamestown to the contemporary era, the story of America is messy, human, and extraordinary. It is a tale of courage and failure, injustice and reform, oppression and resistance. History is rarely linear, and progress is never inevitable. It is shaped by the choices, resilience, and creativity of ordinary people. Enslaved individuals resisting bondage, Native Americans defending their homelands, immigrants forging new lives, workers fighting for fair treatment, activists demanding justice. These are the threads that hold the true history of America together. What school never taught you is that America is not just a series of events led by presidents and generals. It is the countless, often untold stories of human beings navigating a complex, changing, and often contradictory world. It is messy, vibrant, and alive, and it is far from finished. The past is not a relic. It is a living force, shaping the present and illuminating the possibilities for the future. The first settlers in Jamestown did not arrive with visions of heroism. They arrived with uncertainty, hunger, and fear. Imagine a young Englishman named Thomas who left his small village near the Thames in 1607, clutching a chest containing a few clothes, a family Bible, and a letter promising opportunity in the New World. The voyage was harrowing. Storms tossed the ship, seasickness emptied stomachs, and the threat of piracy or disease loomed constantly. When Thomas finally set foot on the marshy banks of the James River, he found a landscape both breathtaking and deadly. Mosquitoes swarmed, salt water mixed with fresh, and the distant forest echoed with the unfamiliar calls of wildlife. Survival was the first priority. Settlers struggled to build shelters while navigating relations with the Powhatan Confederacy. Negotiation was precarious. The indigenous people were neither enemies nor allies, but skilled diplomats and warriors with their own political agendas. When trade faltered, settlers like Thomas went hungry. When misunderstanding escalated, violence erupted. John Smith's famous encounter with Pocahontas, often romanticized, was less a fairy tale than a story of political maneuvering and survival, a reminder that cross-cultural interaction in early America was complex, fraught, and dangerous. By the winter of 1609-1610, Jamestown faced what would be called the starving time. Food shortages, disease, and internecine conflict pushed men and women to the brink. Thomas wrote in his journal, now lost but recorded by historians, that he had seen neighbors die of hunger, witnessed the desperate consumption of horses, dogs, and even tree bark, and questioned whether they would survive. Yet, amid despair, ingenuity and resilience prevailed. Settlers learned from the Powhatan how to cultivate corn, fish, and hunt local game, blending European survival strategies with indigenous knowledge, a hidden story rarely emphasized in school textbooks. Across the continent, the Pilgrims in Plymouth faced different but equally severe challenges. Samuel, traveling with his family on the Mayflower, remembered the biting cold of the first winter and the eerie silence of a forest empty of familiar faces. Half the passengers died before spring, yet bonds formed quickly between survivors and the Wampanoag people. Squanto, who had survived kidnapping and slavery in Europe before returning home, taught the settlers to plant corn, fish in local rivers, and build effective shelters. These exchanges were not simple acts of generosity, they were careful negotiations of survival, diplomacy, and power. Education and literacy shaped these early societies in surprising ways. Wealthy boys in Massachusetts might study Latin and philosophy, yet girls, farm laborers, and enslaved children had limited access to formal education. Still, ordinary people found ways to learn, Apprenticeships, family instruction, and informal reading circles allowed knowledge to circulate beyond elite classrooms. In some ways, the survival of these communities depended on practical intelligence, knowing how to grow crops, navigate rivers, negotiate with neighbors, and endure harsh winters. As colonies expanded, tension with Britain simmered beneath the surface. Taxation without representation, trade restrictions, and legal disputes turned everyday activities, buying tea, selling goods, or paying a local tax, into acts laden with political meaning. In Boston, merchants and artisans like Abigail and James organized boycotts and circulated pamphlets in coffee houses, turning ordinary neighborhoods into hubs of resistance. The Boston Tea Party, often romanticized as a single bold act, was preceded by months of organizing, debate, and quiet defiance by countless unnamed people whose stories rarely appear in textbooks.
The Revolutionary War which followed was not a neat tale of strategy and heroism. Battles were chaotic, confusing, and brutal. In Lexington and Concord, militias fired upon British troops amid panic, confusion, and fear. Families hid in cellars, women tended to the wounded, and children watched as their towns were transformed into theaters of violence. African Americans and Native Americans made difficult choices, balancing survival with the hope for rights, land, or freedom. Their stories, like that of Crispus Attucks, who became the first casualty of the Boston Massacre, remind us that ordinary people bore the consequences of grand historical movements. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 codified ideals of liberty, yet these ideals were far from universal. Enslaved people, women, and Native Americans remained excluded, and debates over slavery, land, and governance simmered even as the nation fought for freedom. Figures like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams worked tirelessly in diplomacy and law, but much of the revolution's impact was experienced by ordinary citizens, farmers supplying militias, women managing households under threat, and townspeople navigating the chaos of occupation and conflict. The war for independence had ended, but the question that haunted the new nation was deceptively simple. How would 13 diverse, often fractious colonies unite under a single government? For ordinary Americans, this was not an abstract legal debate. In small towns, farmers like Margaret and Samuel debated taxes, land disputes, and militia obligations in town halls. In port cities, merchants worried about trade restrictions and international relations. The Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, gave the federal government little power to enforce law, raise revenue, or mediate disputes. For many, it seemed that victory against Britain had simply replaced one set of uncertainties with another. By 1787, delegates from the states gathered in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. Inside the sweltering rooms of Independence Hall, political titans like George Washington, James Madison, and Benjamin Franklin debated for hours over representation, taxation, and the powers of the presidency. The Three-Fifths Compromise exposed the moral contradictions of the era, counting enslaved people partially for representation while denying them freedom. Native Americans were not invited, even as their lands were claimed and encroached upon. Ordinary people followed the debates with a mix of excitement, skepticism, and anxiety, sometimes reading drafts in newspapers, sometimes attending local meetings where speeches and pamphlets circulated. When the Constitution was signed in 1787, it was not a declaration of universal freedom. It was a carefully negotiated compromise. Federalists argued that a strong central government was essential for survival and prosperity. Anti-Federalists warned that concentrated power threatened liberty and could easily be abused. Letters poured into newspapers, pamphlets were handed from hand to hand, and citizens in towns across the new nation debated in homes, taverns, and meeting houses.
People like Abigail Adams wrote letters pleading for the recognition of women's rights, while enslaved people and free African Americans questioned how freedom could coexist with bondage. These were not mere footnotes, they were central to understanding the tensions and possibilities of the early republic. In 1789, George Washington became the first president. Ordinary Americans, from farmers to merchants, watched closely as he established precedents that would define the presidency: neutrality in foreign affairs, the peaceful transfer of power, and a measured use of federal authority. Yet even in Washington's time, unrest simmered. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 erupted when farmers in western Pennsylvania resisted a federal excise tax on distilled spirits. For men like Daniel, a distiller whose livelihood depended on whiskey, the tax was more than financial. It was a threat to survival and dignity. Washington's decision to send troops to suppress the rebellion demonstrated the fragile balance between liberty and law, illustrating that freedom in practice was complex, contested, and sometimes enforced through force. Meanwhile, the young nation expanded westward. Settlers like Daniel Boone became legendary for their daring explorations of Kentucky and the Ohio Valley, yet the journey was perilous. Dense forests, unpredictable rivers, and harsh winters were constant threats, and relations with Native Americans were fraught with negotiation, conflict, and misunderstanding. Every log cabin erected in the wilderness represented hope, risk, and the displacement of indigenous peoples. Ordinary settlers confronted hunger, disease, and isolation while navigating a world of opportunity and danger. The early republic also faced the moral and political dilemmas of slavery. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 intensified the South's dependence on enslaved labor, even as northern states began gradual emancipation. Enslaved individuals resisted constantly, through subtle acts like breaking tools, slowing work, and preserving cultural practices, or through daring escapes via the early networks that would later become the Underground Railroad. Their stories, often omitted from textbooks, reveal the courage and agency of people living under oppression while shaping the nation in profound ways. At the same time, America was defining its place in the wider world. Trade, diplomacy, and occasional conflict with European powers required careful navigation. Embargoes, tariffs, and negotiations were not just policies, they affected the daily lives of ship captains, merchants, farmers, and consumers. Ordinary citizens experienced these decisions directly. Goods became scarce, prices fluctuated, and communities dependent on trade faced uncertainty. The early republic was a nation experimenting in democracy while balancing the practical realities of survival, commerce, and governance. By the early 1800s, political divisions were sharpening. Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans emphasized agrarian values and limited federal government, while Federalists advocated commerce, infrastructure, and centralized authority. Debates were lively, often carried out in newspapers, pamphlets, and local meetings, where ordinary people voiced their opinions. These were not abstract philosophical arguments. They shaped the daily lives of citizens, influencing taxes, trade, militia service, and the direction of westward expansion.
The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, negotiated by Jefferson, doubled the nation's territory and opened vast new lands for settlement. Lewis and Clark's expedition documented geography, wildlife, and interactions with native nations, providing a record that was part exploration, part diplomacy, and part assertion of American claims. Yet this expansion came at a cost. Native nations were increasingly displaced, and settlers faced harsh wilderness conditions. Every mile westward represented opportunity for some, danger for others, and moral compromise for the nation as a whole. The young republic was restless. The Appalachian Mountains no longer seemed an insurmountable barrier. Families and settlers were moving westward in droves, driven by the promise of fertile land, new opportunity, and a chance to escape the economic and social hierarchies of the East. For people like Thomas and Mary, a farming couple leaving Virginia for the Ohio Valley, the journey was perilous. Wagons creaked over uneven paths, rivers threatened to sweep away livestock, and encounters with wildlife and disease were constant threats. But the horizon promised something no city street or crowded eastern village could: autonomy, land, and the hope of legacy. Westward expansion was never simply a matter of adventure. Native nations were the original stewards of these lands, and settlers' arrival sparked complex negotiations and violent conflict. Treaties were often made under duress, misunderstood, or ignored entirely. Leaders like Tecumseh of the Shawnee Confederacy recognized the existential threat posed by settlers and tried to unite indigenous nations in defense of their homelands. Ordinary people, both settlers and Native Americans, navigated these tensions daily, balancing survival, diplomacy, and resistance. For many, every meal, every mile traveled, and every negotiation carried the weight of life or death. Meanwhile, the War of 1812 erupted, fueled by unresolved tensions with Britain, trade restrictions, and frontier conflicts. For ordinary Americans, the war was a patchwork of uncertainty. In cities like Baltimore and New Orleans, civilians faced bombardments, disrupted commerce, and shortages. Soldiers endured harsh conditions, from freezing winters in northern campaigns to the swamps and bayous of the South. Figures like Andrew Jackson rose to prominence, but the war's victories and defeats were deeply human stories of improvisation, endurance, and loss. At the Battle of New Orleans, for instance, soldiers and militia, some ordinary farmers and frontiersmen, held the line in freezing fog and mud, their courage immortalized in legend, even as their suffering and fear remain largely untold. The conclusion of the war brought a new sense of nationalism, but also exposed growing sectional tensions. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, which admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, temporarily balanced political power, yet it foreshadowed decades of conflict. Farmers, merchants, enslaved people, and abolitionists all felt the consequences. Every debate over land, labor, and representation touched lives directly. A farmer in Kentucky wondered whether new legislation might affect his livelihood, while enslaved individuals in the South contemplated the expansion of bondage into newly claimed territories. By the 1820s and 1830s, American politics was changing. Andrew Jackson's rise to the presidency reflected the growing power of the common man, or at least the white male property-owning electorate. Jacksonian democracy expanded participation in voting and public debate, yet this progress was limited, often excluding women, African Americans, and Native Americans. The Trail of Tears, forcibly removing Cherokee and other nations from their ancestral lands, highlighted the human cost of political and territorial ambition. Families were uprooted, communities destroyed, and thousands died from disease, starvation, and exposure, leaving a permanent scar on the nation's moral consciousness. Meanwhile, the economy was transforming. The market revolution introduced new technologies, canals, steamboats, and early railroads that connected regions, facilitated trade, and altered daily life. For a small merchant in upstate New York, the Erie Canal might mean access to distant markets and greater profits. For a farmer, it meant adjusting to competition and fluctuating prices. Women contributed in both visible and invisible ways, running households, assisting in family businesses, and managing farms, their labor essential, but often overlooked. Social movements also began to emerge during this period. The Second Great Awakening, a religious revival sweeping the nation, inspired moral reform and activism. Preachers and lay people alike promoted temperance, prison reform, and the abolition of slavery.
Ordinary citizens, often farmers, shopkeepers, and women, participated in these movements, traveling to meetings, circulating pamphlets, and organizing petitions. These grassroots efforts demonstrated that historical change was not solely the domain of presidents, generals, or elites, but deeply rooted in everyday human agency. By the mid-1830s, America was a nation in motion, geographically, economically, and socially. The frontier beckoned, the market economy expanded, and political and moral debates intensified. Yet every mile westward, every canal dug, and every law passed had human consequences. Families left homes and communities. Native nations resisted and adapted. Enslaved people resisted in myriad ways, and ordinary Americans navigated opportunities and threats in ways that shaped the trajectory of the nation. By the 1840s and 1850s, the United States was a nation brimming with ambition, wealth, and deep contradictions. On one hand, technological innovations, railroads, telegraphs, and steamships connected cities and regions like never before. On the other, the moral and political fault lines of the nation deepened, particularly around slavery, westward expansion, and the meaning of liberty. In the South, the invention of the cotton gin decades earlier had transformed the economy. Plantations stretched across landscapes, producing cotton that fueled northern textile mills and international trade. Families like the Carters and the Johnsons thrived economically, yet their wealth depended entirely on forced labor of enslaved men, women, and children. Enslaved people, names often lost to history, resisted in countless ways, learning to read in secret, slowing production, sabotaging equipment, fleeing to the North, or simply surviving under inhuman conditions. Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and countless others were part of a living, breathing struggle for freedom that defied the neat narratives taught in school.
Meanwhile, the North industrialized rapidly. Cities swelled with immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and later Italy and Eastern Europe. Factories provided opportunity, but at tremendous human cost. Long hours, dangerous machinery, child labor, and overcrowded housing. A young Irish immigrant girl named Bridget might work 12 hours a day in a textile mill, dreaming of education or a better future while fearing injury or illness. Workers began organizing strikes and labor unions, laying the groundwork for a social consciousness that was as revolutionary as any political ideology. Westward expansion continued to redefine the nation, bringing new territories into the orbit of conflict. The annexation of Texas, the Mexican-American War, and debates over whether slavery would expand westward ignited fierce political battles. Soldiers marched across deserts and mountains, settlers carved out homesteads, and native nations were again displaced or coerced into treaties that benefited others at their expense. Diaries from this period reveal the human side of these conflicts: hunger, disease, fear, and the constant struggle to survive in uncharted lands. At the same time, social reform movements flourished. The Second Great Awakening, already underway in the early 19th century, inspired abolitionists, temperance advocates, and educational reformers. Women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized conventions demanding suffrage, education, and legal equality. Abolitionists, including William Lloyd Garrison, Angelina Grimke, and Theodore Weld, risked personal safety and public censure to confront slavery head-on. These movements intersected in fascinating ways. Churches became centers of activism, newspapers carried fiery rhetoric, and local communities debated morality, economy, and justice in intensely personal ways. Political tensions reflected these social divisions. The Missouri Compromise had been only a temporary solution. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 unleashed violence in the territories, with pro- and anti-slavery settlers clashing in a period known as Bleeding Kansas. Ordinary people,
Farmers, laborers, shopkeepers were drawn into this struggle, sometimes directly fighting, sometimes sheltering neighbors, and sometimes trying to navigate a society on the brink of fracture. By the late 1850s, the nation faced an existential crisis. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision denied citizenship and legal rights to African Americans, inflaming national tensions. The rise of Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the expansion of slavery, catalyzed secessionist sentiment in the South. South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, and other states claimed the right to leave a union they said no longer represented them. Behind political rhetoric, millions of ordinary Americans, enslaved families, immigrant workers, rural farmers, grappled with uncertainty, fear, and hope. The stage was set for the Civil War, a conflict that would be chaotic, brutal, and transformative. Battles like Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg were not orderly affairs of strategy and heroism. They were terrifying, improvised, and human. Soldiers faced frostbite, disease, hunger, and relentless artillery. Civilians were forced to confront the destruction of homes, towns, and livelihoods. Enslaved people seized the war as an opportunity. Some fled plantations when Union forces approached, seeking protection and the chance to claim a new life. Others sabotaged crops, destroyed tools, and organized clandestine communities of resistance. Figures like Harriet Tubman returned to the South, guiding enslaved families to freedom while gathering intelligence for the Union Army. These acts were not heroic embellishments, they were daily risks, often punishable by death, that shaped the outcome of the war in ways rarely acknowledged in school lessons. In addition to the human cost, the war reshaped society. African American soldiers, often segregated into units like the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, fought bravely despite prejudice, poor supplies, and unequal pay. Women took on new roles, running farms, managing businesses, serving as nurses, and acting as spies. Communities adapted to shortages and uncertainty, and ordinary citizens, both North and South, wrestled with fear, grief, and the struggle to maintain some semblance of daily life. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 marked a turning point, signaling that the war was now explicitly about ending slavery. But freedom was far from immediate or absolute. Enslaved people had to navigate the dangers of fleeing, the challenge of survival in a war-torn landscape, and the ongoing hostility of white communities resistant to change. For many, freedom came with the responsibility of survival in a world that had long denied them autonomy.
The war finally ended in April 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse, but the nation faced the monumental task of Reconstruction. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments legally abolished slavery, guaranteed citizenship, and extended voting rights to African American men, but legal victories did not automatically translate to social or economic equality. Freed people built schools, churches, and communities, striving to claim a place in American life even as violence and intimidation, particularly from groups like the Ku Klux Klan, sought to suppress them. Politics during Reconstruction was volatile. African Americans were elected to state legislatures and Congress, influencing laws on public education, labor rights, and civil protections. Yet the federal government struggled to enforce these changes amid persistent Southern resistance. For ordinary citizens, Reconstruction was a time of both hope and fear. Families reunited after slavery. Children attended schools for the first time, yet the threat of violence and poverty remained ever present. Meanwhile, the nation's economy began shifting again. Railroads expanded, connecting cities and farms, while industrialization accelerated in the North. Factories, mines, and mills demanded labor, drawing immigrants from Europe and reshaping urban landscapes. These workers faced long hours, unsafe conditions, and discrimination, yet their efforts built the foundations of America's industrial power.
In rural areas, formerly enslaved families sought to establish farms or tenant arrangements, navigating a system that often limited their economic freedom. The Reconstruction era, while short-lived in federal enforcement, planted seeds of transformation. Ordinary people, freed people building schools, women advocating for rights, workers organizing for fair treatment, and immigrants creating new communities shaped the nation's social, cultural, and political future in ways that textbooks often overlook. The promise of equality was incomplete, yet the courage, resilience, and agency of these individuals laid the groundwork for future movements and struggles. By the 1870s, the Civil War and Reconstruction were behind the nation, but the scars they left were visible in every corner. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh were booming with industrial activity. Smoke from factories darkened the skies, rivers carried refuse from mills, and streets teemed with people, immigrants, laborers, shopkeepers, and children rushing to and from work. It was an era of enormous wealth for a few and crushing poverty for many. For a young Irish immigrant named Patrick, arriving in New York Harbor in 1873, life was both a promise and a trial. He faced cramped tenements, barely livable wages, and the constant threat of disease. He worked long days in the docks, loading cargo from ships, often for pennies, while his wife and children managed household chores in a single room shared with multiple families. Yet Patrick's experience was not unique. Millions of immigrants, German, Italian, Chinese, and others, flooded into cities, shaping neighborhoods, culture, and the labor force. Their labor built railroads, bridges, and skyscrapers, even as many Americans resisted their presence, fearing economic competition and cultural change. Industrial magnates, sometimes called robber barons, amassed vast fortunes. Andrew Carnegie built an empire of steel. John D. Rockefeller dominated oil, and Cornelius Vanderbilt controlled railroads. Their innovations transformed transportation, energy, and commerce, but their success came at human cost. Long hours, unsafe working conditions, and child labor were widespread. Workers responded with strikes and union organizing, sometimes leading to violence. The Homestead Strike of 1892, for instance, pitted steel workers against private security forces, leaving dozens dead and injured. Ordinary laborers risked everything to demand fair treatment, highlighting the tension between progress and justice in a rapidly changing economy. Rural life also shifted during this period. Farmers faced falling crop prices, mounting debt, and harsh weather conditions. The populist movement emerged in response, advocating for currency reform, railroad regulation, and greater political representation. Ordinary farmers traveled to town halls, circulated petitions, and formed alliances, demonstrating that grassroots organizing could influence national policy. These movements were often overlooked in school histories, yet they reveal a nation negotiating economic upheaval and political power from the ground up. Immigration continued to transform American society. In the South and West, Chinese laborers worked on railroads and in agriculture under harsh conditions, facing legal discrimination and violence. Japanese immigrants established communities along the Pacific coast, contributing to commerce, farming, and cultural exchange despite systemic prejudice. Across the nation, immigrants preserved traditions, created new neighborhoods, and built institutions, from churches to theaters, while navigating the challenges of assimilation, xenophobia, and economic survival. The Gilded Age also saw women's activism and education. Reformers like Jane Addams in Chicago opened settlement houses, providing education, health care, and legal assistance to immigrants and the poor. Women organized temperance societies, suffrage campaigns, and labor advocacy groups, often facing ridicule and resistance. Their work laid the foundation for the Progressive Era and demonstrated that ordinary citizens, especially women, could shape society in profound ways. Technological innovations reshaped daily life. Electricity illuminated homes and factories, telegraphs and telephones connected cities, and mechanized farming equipment transformed rural labor. For families in the Midwest, these changes could mean greater productivity, but also new dependencies and challenges. Children might attend school for the first time, yet many still worked on farms or in factories. The rhythm of daily life became intertwined with machines, markets, and urban growth, creating both opportunity and strain. As the century drew to a close, social tensions intensified. Labor unrest, racial violence, and political corruption underscored the inequality underlying apparent progress. The 1890s saw the rise of lynching in the South as a tool of racial terror, targeting African Americans who sought economic or political independence. The Pullman strike of 1894 demonstrated the fragile balance between labor, government, and corporate power. Ordinary Americans experienced these conflicts directly, whether through participation, observation, or the simple struggle to survive in communities buffeted by economic and social change.
By the turn of the 20th century, America was a nation of contrasts. Skyscrapers rose beside slums, factories hummed with industry while farms struggled against debt, and a tide of immigrants brought new languages, customs, and labor to the rapidly expanding cities. Ordinary Americans were at the center of this transformation. Factory workers toiled in dangerous conditions, children ran errands or labored alongside parents, and women navigated societal expectations while participating quietly, or sometimes boldly, in public life. The Progressive Era emerged in response to these inequalities, championed by reformers who sought to curb corporate power, protect workers, and expand democracy. Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago offered immigrants education, health care, and community organizing, providing a lifeline to those navigating the challenges of urban life. In New York, settlement houses, labor unions, and women's clubs became centers of activism, where ordinary people, immigrants, teachers, and volunteers fought for better working conditions, public health reforms, and political representation. Muckraking journalists brought the realities of urban and industrial life into public view. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle revealed the horrifying conditions of Chicago's meatpacking plants, shocking middle-class Americans and prompting government reforms. Ida B. Wells traveled through the South documenting lynchings, exposing the terror African Americans faced daily under Jim Crow laws. These stories remind us that the Progressive Era was not just about policy. It was about human lives, courage, and the relentless effort of ordinary people to make society just. Women's suffrage became a central issue. Leaders like Susan A. Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt, and Alice Paul fought tirelessly, organizing marches, lobbying politicians, and enduring arrests and public ridicule. Yet the movement was not universally inclusive. African American women, Native women, and immigrant women often faced exclusion, highlighting the limits of legal reform when social attitudes lagged. Still, by 1920, the 19th Amendment secured the vote for women, marking a milestone that reflected decades of persistent activism. As the nation reformed internally, it was also looking outward. Trade, diplomacy, and global ambitions shaped policy, while the First World War loomed in Europe. Initially, the U.S. sought neutrality, but by 1917, unrestricted submarine warfare and economic interests drew the nation into the conflict. Ordinary Americans, farmers, factory workers, immigrants, and soldiers felt the impact immediately. Men were drafted, leaving farms and families behind. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Communities adjusted to shortages, rationing, and the uncertainties of wartime life. African Americans faced a paradoxical situation. The war opened opportunities for industrial jobs in northern cities, prompting the Great Migration, yet racial discrimination persisted both at home and in the military.
Segregated units like the Harlem Hellfighters demonstrated courage and skill on the battlefields of France, challenging prejudiced assumptions while enduring the harsh realities of systemic racism. The home front was equally transformative. Civilian efforts, war gardens, fundraising drives, and volunteer organizations reshaped the role of citizens, especially women. Immigrant communities navigated loyalty and suspicion, while activists and journalists highlighted inequities, sparking debates over civil liberties and national purpose. The war amplified voices that had long been marginalized, revealing that history was being made not only by generals and politicians, but by ordinary individuals confronting extraordinary circumstances. By the time the war ended in 1918, America had been changed profoundly. The influenza pandemic compounded the human cost, claiming millions of lives worldwide and straining communities already exhausted by war. Soldiers returned home to cities and towns reshaped by industrial growth, social reform, and cultural change. The 1920s would bring both economic prosperity and social turbulence, but the Progressive Era and the war had shown that ordinary people, through activism, labor, migration, and community, were central to shaping the nation's path. The 1920s roared across America like jazz echoing through crowded speakeasies. Cities pulsed with energy as skyscrapers rose and automobiles transformed landscapes. For ordinary Americans, life was both exhilarating and precarious. In New York's Harlem, African American communities produced an unprecedented cultural renaissance. Poets, musicians, and artists, people like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Duke Ellington, captured the vibrancy, frustrations, and aspirations of a community long marginalized. For teenagers and young adults like Ella, working in a garment factory by day and dancing in Harlem clubs by night, the era offered a taste of freedom, self-expression, and hope for something larger than survival. Yet beneath the glamour, economic instability simmered. Farmers in the Midwest struggled as crop prices fell, debt mounted, and environmental conditions worsened. Immigrant workers in cities often toiled long hours in factories, garment shops, or docks, vulnerable to exploitation, unsafe conditions, and wage theft. Women who had tasted independence during World War I were navigating the push and pull of traditional expectations, social freedoms, and economic necessity. The Roaring '20s were vibrant, but only for some. Many Americans experienced hardship, uncertainty, and exclusion from the prosperity often celebrated in history books. By 1929, the illusion of endless prosperity shattered. The stock market crash heralded the Great Depression, a period of economic collapse that affected nearly every family. Bread lines stretched down city streets, farms were foreclosed, leaving families destitute, and millions faced unemployment, hunger, and the erosion of hope. Yet ordinary Americans adapted with ingenuity, community, and resilience. Neighbors shared what little they had, informal markets sprang up, and families migrated in search of work and survival. Children's lives were deeply affected. Many left school to work in factories, on farms, or as street vendors. Health and nutrition suffered, and yet creativity and resourcefulness flourished. Oral histories from the era recount children collecting scrap materials, helping neighbors, and finding small joys in music, radio, and storytelling, even amid despair. These stories are the hidden backbone of the Depression, not just economic statistics, but lived human experience, courage, and adaptation.
The election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932 brought hope through the New Deal. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, Works Progress Administration, WPA, and Social Security fundamentally reshaped the relationship between citizens and government. Millions of ordinary Americans found work building roads, bridges, schools, and parks. Women often managed programs in local communities, while artists, writers, and photographers were employed to capture the nation's stories. The Federal Writers Project preserved countless personal histories that might otherwise have been lost, documenting the experiences of farmers, immigrants, and marginalized communities. Still, the New Deal was imperfect. African Americans frequently received lower pay or were excluded from programs. Native Americans faced ongoing struggles with land rights and sovereignty, and women often faced systemic barriers despite their contributions. Yet the era demonstrated the power of collective action, federal responsibility, and civic engagement. It was ordinary people, the workers, farmers, teachers, and activists who gave life to these programs, shaping infrastructure, art, and social policy in ways that continue to affect America today. By the late 1930s, as Europe slid toward war, the nation faced both recovery and uncertainty. Families prepared for possible conflict, industries shifted toward defense production, and communities debated isolationism versus international engagement. The Great Depression had left an imprint on the American psyche, a recognition of vulnerability, the necessity of solidarity, and the understanding that government could, for better or worse, profoundly shape daily life. By 1939, Europe was again at war, and while the United States initially remained neutral, ordinary Americans watched with growing concern. Families listened to radio broadcasts describing the Blitz in London, German invasions, and the plight of refugees. Young men and women read newspapers and shared whispers of the horrors overseas, wondering when or if their nation would be drawn in. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, shattered that neutrality. The day began like any other for most Americans, but by late afternoon, shock and grief spread across the nation. Ordinary families faced immediate consequences. Fathers and sons were drafted, mothers took on increased responsibility at home, and children experienced anxiety and uncertainty for the first time. In cities like San Francisco and New York, neighbors watched planes and naval convoys with new attention, while communities mobilized to support soldiers and war production. The home front transformed in unprecedented ways. Factories that had produced automobiles, clothing, or consumer goods were rapidly converted to produce tanks, airplanes, ships, and munitions. Women, long restricted in their economic roles, entered industrial work en masse. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol, but behind the icon were millions of real women, teachers, clerks, farmers, learning to operate machinery, navigate factory hierarchies, and contribute to national defense while caring for families. For African American women, labor opportunities increased, but discrimination persisted, both on the job and in housing, highlighting the paradoxes of a nation fighting tyranny abroad while struggling with injustice at home. African American men and women also faced duo battles, the fight against fascism overseas and racism at home. The Tuskegee Airmen, segregated units of black pilots, proved their skill and courage in the skies, while soldiers in other units endured segregation, unequal pay, and prejudice. On the home front, activists pushed for civil rights, leading to the 1941 Double V campaign, which demanded victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racial inequality. Ordinary citizens, teachers, activists, and community organizers made these campaigns tangible, distributing pamphlets, organizing rallies, and pressuring local and national leaders. Japanese American families faced a darker reality. Executive Order 9066 authorized the forced relocation and internment of tens of thousands of citizens and residents. Families were uprooted from homes, businesses were lost, and communities were torn apart.
In camps like Manzanar and Topaz, children attended hastily organized schools, parents struggled to provide for families, and ordinary life continued under extraordinary restrictions. Yet amid hardship, these communities found ways to educate, create, and maintain dignity, resisting erasure and preserving their culture. Meanwhile, soldiers across the globe faced unimaginable danger. Ordinary Americans fought in the jungles of the Pacific, the deserts of North Africa, and the streets of Europe. Letters and diaries revealed the fear, courage, and longing of young men and women. A soldier in Normandy describes the roar of artillery, the smell of mud and smoke, and the fleeting joy of letters from home. A nurse in the Philippines documents tending to wounded soldiers and civilians under the threat of Japanese occupation. The war was simultaneously a monumental historical event and a profoundly personal experience, shaping lives in ways textbooks often reduce to dates and battle names. The conclusion of World War II in 1945 brought relief, grief, and transformation. Millions of soldiers returned home, eager to resume civilian life, but the nation itself had changed. The GI Bill offered educational and housing opportunities, yet systemic discrimination meant that many African Americans, Native Americans, and women were unable to access the full benefits. Suburbs expanded, industries boomed, and new consumer culture emerged, yet inequalities persisted. Ordinary Americans navigated this new landscape, striving for stability, opportunity, and recognition in a society that was both hopeful and imperfect. At the same time, global responsibilities weighed heavily. The United States emerged as a superpower, reshaping international institutions, engaging in reconstruction abroad, and navigating the early stages of the Cold War. Citizens experienced these changes indirectly through civil defense drills, news broadcasts, and debates over foreign policy, but their lives were affected nonetheless as the global order reshaped the economy, culture, and daily life at home.
The end of World War II brought relief, but it also marked the beginning of a new era of tension. By the late 1940s, the United States found itself locked in a global struggle with the Soviet Union, an ideological battle that would define nearly every aspect of life for decades. Ordinary Americans felt the Cold War in unexpected ways: air raid drills in schools, bomb shelters in backyards, and the constant hum of propaganda warning of communism's threat. Teenagers like Robert in Ohio practiced duck-and-cover exercises in classrooms, wondering if their everyday routines could truly protect them from the unimaginable. Meanwhile, the post-war economy created unprecedented prosperity, particularly for white Americans. Suburbs expanded rapidly, cars became household staples, and television brought a new shared culture into living rooms. Yet this prosperity was far from universal. African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, and other marginalized groups often faced systemic exclusion from home loans, education, and employment. Cities swelled with poverty, and racial segregation dictated where people could live, learn, and work. Ordinary citizens experienced these divides daily, negotiating opportunity and exclusion in ways that shaped entire communities. Amid this tension, the civil rights movement emerged, transforming the nation through both courage and ordinary activism. In Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her bus seat in 1955 sparked a boycott that united black residents across the city. Martin Luther King Jr., while a prominent figure, relied on countless unnamed people, teachers, clergy, students, and workers who organized meetings, distributed flyers, and risked their lives for justice.
Ordinary individuals, from children in lunch counter sit-ins to farmers participating in Freedom Summer, brought the ideals of liberty and equality into tangible action, often facing violence, arrest, or economic retaliation. The struggle for civil rights was not confined to the South. Northern cities experienced de facto segregation, police brutality, and systemic inequities in housing and employment. Activists in Chicago, Detroit, and New York organized campaigns for fair housing, better schools, and equitable employment. Immigrant communities, Native nations, and women's groups intersected with these movements, highlighting the broader struggle for equality in everyday American life. Ordinary people were not just witnesses, they were participants, shaping the moral and political arc of the nation. Meanwhile, the Cold War reached into daily life. Fear of nuclear annihilation, McCarthyism, and anti-communist hysteria influenced education, employment, and politics. Families worried about loyalty oaths, suspected neighbors, and ideological conformity. Scientists, teachers, artists, and writers navigated these pressures while continuing their work, sometimes quietly resisting and sometimes participating in the prevailing culture of fear. The 1960s and 1970s brought a broader wave of social transformation. The women's liberation movement challenged workplace discrimination, reproductive restrictions, and cultural expectations. Ordinary women organized consciousness-raising groups, lobbied for legal reform, and transformed communities, schools, and workplaces. Native American activists, through organizations like the American Indian Movement, sought sovereignty, cultural preservation, and justice, confronting decades of displacement and marginalization. Environmental activists, responding to pollution, deforestation, and chemical disasters, pushed for regulations that would protect communities, wildlife, and future generations. Cultural life also reflected these changes. Music, literature, and film became vehicles for expression, protest, and identity. Bob Dylan's songs, Maya Angelou's poetry, and films addressing social injustice provided ordinary Americans with language to articulate hopes, grievances, and dreams. Teenagers experimented with new styles, questioning traditional authority and forging identities that both reflected and challenged the broader social landscape. At the same time, wars abroad, particularly the conflict in Vietnam, brought personal loss and national debate into American homes. Soldiers and their families experienced the trauma of war firsthand, while anti-war protests, draft resistance, and public demonstrations reshaped politics and culture. Ordinary people were both participants and witnesses, experiencing grief, moral dilemmas, and the consequences of decisions made in distant capitals. By the 1970s, the United States was a nation transformed, legally, socially, and culturally. The struggles of civil rights, women's liberation, environmentalism, and anti-war activism demonstrated that history was made not only by presidents, generals, or legislators, but by ordinary citizens taking action in everyday life. Communities, families, and individuals collectively pushed the nation toward greater justice, awareness, and opportunity, even as inequalities and challenges remained. By the 1980s, America was a nation undergoing rapid transformation. Suburban life expanded, cable television and personal computers began entering homes, and the economy shifted from manufacturing to service and technology. Ordinary Americans, teachers, factory workers, immigrants, and teenagers experienced these changes in their daily routines. A teenager in Los Angeles might spend evenings experimenting with a Commodore 64, while her parents navigated layoffs in a declining factory, and her immigrant neighbors balanced new opportunities with cultural adjustment. Globalization began reshaping commerce and culture. Factories in the Rust Belt closed or outsourced production overseas, creating uncertainty for working-class families. Meanwhile, corporations expanded internationally, linking markets and cultures in ways that were both exciting and destabilizing. Ordinary workers felt the impact directly: layoffs, retraining, and the need to adapt to a rapidly changing economy. Communities that once thrived on local industry struggled to maintain identity, cohesion, and opportunity. The 1980s and 1990s also saw a renewed focus on political polarization and cultural debates. Issues like civil rights, gender equality, LGBTQ+ activism, immigration, and environmental concerns were central to public life. Grassroots activism became increasingly visible. Ordinary citizens organized marches, lobbied local officials, created nonprofits, and used new technologies to amplify their voices. From small-town school boards to urban neighborhoods, individuals shaped policy, public discourse, and community priorities. Technological innovation reshaped daily life in profound ways. Personal computers, the internet, and mobile communications revolutionized work, education, and social interaction. Families navigated the opportunities and anxieties of these changes, from teenagers exploring online communities to adults managing work-life balance in an increasingly connected world. Technology brought both empowerment and new pressures, highlighting the ways ordinary Americans adapted to rapid societal shifts.
Meanwhile, social movements continued to shape culture and policy. LGBTQ+ communities fought for recognition, legal protections, and social acceptance. Women's advocacy expanded beyond workplace equality to reproductive rights, sexual harassment, and political representation. Environmental activism gained traction as awareness of climate change, pollution, and sustainability grew. In every case, ordinary people, students, teachers, scientists, community organizers drove progress, demonstrating that civic engagement is often quiet, persistent, and grounded in daily life rather than headlines. The 1990s and early 2000s also brought dramatic geopolitical change. The collapse of the Soviet Union, conflicts in the Middle East, and the rise of global terrorism reshaped national priorities. Ordinary Americans responded in myriad ways: families with loved ones in the military, communities affected by policy decisions, students navigating global awareness in classrooms, and local activists advocating for peace, human rights, and international cooperation. National security debates, economic shifts, and global interconnections were experienced personally as citizens felt the implications of decisions made far from their hometowns. Cultural change accelerated alongside technology and globalization. Music, television, film, and later social media allowed voices previously marginalized to be heard widely. Hip-hop, independent films, viral journalism, and internet communities reshaped identity, politics, and society. Young people and older generations alike participated in shaping culture, blending local traditions with global influences. Ordinary Americans created art, shared experiences, and formed communities that challenged the dominant narratives of power and privilege. As the 21st century began, new challenges and opportunities emerged. Economic crises, wars abroad, technological dependence, climate change, and social justice movements underscored that ordinary people were once again central to the story of America. Families, students, workers, and activists experienced both disruption and possibility. Grassroots movements from Black Lives Matter to climate activism demonstrated that citizens could reshape national conversations, challenge entrenched systems, and pursue justice, echoing patterns of civic engagement stretching back to Jamestown and the Revolution. In the contemporary era, history is alive in the everyday.
The stories of ordinary Americans, immigrants navigating cultural adjustment, workers responding to automation, teenagers exploring identity in digital spaces, and activists advocating for social change, reveal that history is not just what leaders and battles produce. It is found in neighborhoods, classrooms, workplaces, and homes. It is shaped by decisions, resilience, creativity, and courage on the ground. Understanding these stories allows us to see that American history is not only about iconic figures and dates, it is about people, choices, and consequences in every era for every individual willing to act and endure. From the first days of Jamestown to the digital age of the 21st century, the story of America is not simply the story of presidents, generals, or landmark legislation. It is the story of ordinary people, farmers, artisans, immigrants, enslaved individuals, teachers, soldiers, nurses, laborers, activists, and countless others who lived, struggled, and persisted, often in ways that textbooks overlook. Their lives shaped the nation in ways both visible and subtle, building communities, driving innovation, challenging injustice, and expanding the possibilities of freedom. History shows us patterns. Expansion and migration, for example, reveal both opportunity and conflict. Settlers crossed mountains and rivers seeking land and autonomy, yet their presence displaced native nations and reshaped ecosystems. Wars, from the Revolution to World Wars, reveal both heroism and human cost, demonstrating that freedom and survival are inseparable from sacrifice, fear, and resilience. Social movements, from abolition and women's suffrage to civil rights and contemporary activism, highlight the persistent effort of ordinary people to push the nation toward greater justice, often in the face of entrenched opposition. Economic change, too, is a human story. The rise of industry, the growth of cities, and the shift to a globalized economy brought wealth and opportunity, but also inequality, labor strife, and insecurity. Farmers, workers, and immigrants adapted, resisted, and innovated, showing that the nation's progress depended not solely on technological breakthroughs or policy decisions, but on the labor, ingenuity, and courage of ordinary individuals. Cultural life, literature, music, art, religious movements, and social traditions has always been more than entertainment. It has been a vehicle for expression, resistance, and identity. From Harlem's Renaissance to contemporary social media movements, Americans have used culture to articulate hopes, confront injustice, and create community. These expressions, often dismissed as popular rather than historical, are central to understanding the nation's development.
Perhaps most importantly, American history reminds us that progress is uneven, contested, and incomplete. The fight for equality, justice, and opportunity has always been ongoing, shaped by collective action and individual courage. Enslaved people resisted bondage. Women fought for suffrage and workplace equality. Civil rights activists risked life and limb. Immigrants transformed neighborhoods and economies. Their stories remind us that history is not preordained, but made by those who act, endure, and demand change. When we look at the America of today, diverse, dynamic, and complicated, we see the cumulative effect of these countless lives. Technology, globalization, political movements, cultural shifts, and social reforms are not abstract forces. They are the lived experiences of people navigating opportunity and oppression, risk and hope. Recognizing this human dimension deepens our understanding, allowing us to appreciate the sacrifices, resilience, and creativity that built the nation. What school never taught you about American history is, at its core, a story of ordinary people shaping extraordinary outcomes. It is a reminder that history is not simply a sequence of dates, battles, or leaders, but a living tapestry woven from the choices, courage, struggles, and dreams of everyday Americans. From the first settlers to contemporary activists, from soldiers to teachers, from immigrants to laborers, the nation has been built and continues to be shaped by those whose names rarely appear in textbooks, but whose actions define what it means to live, endure, and strive in America. And so the story continues. Each citizen, each family, and each community participates in history, shaping the future in ways both small and monumental. The lesson is simple yet profound. History is not only something we study, it is something we live, create, and inherit, moment by moment, choice by choice, generation by generation. The past is alive in the present, and the future will be shaped by the same ordinary people whose courage, creativity, and resilience have always propelled this nation forward.